Hey guys, welcome to tonight's channel where the stories that once slept in the past are awakened in the middle of the night. Before we begin, I have a small question. Where are you listening from? In bed, in a dark room, or while the whole city is already asleep? And what time is it now? Whether it's 11 p.m. or 2 inches the morning, turn down the lights, put on your headphones, relax your shoulders, and let the wind of the night take you back to the muddy streets of the Middle Ages, where the smell of smoke, mud, and church bells blended into the breath of history. If you love journeys that explore the dark side of the past, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join me through the nights ahead, because there are still so many secrets they never told you. Now lie down, take a deep breath, and let your mind drift to a time when bathing too often was considered an offense to God, and beer was seen as holy water. You've probably always thought the Middle Ages were full of shining knights in armor, golden-haired princesses at castle windows, and grand fortresses rising from green valleys, right? Well, if you had actually lived back then, you wouldn't have seen much of that just mud, horse dung, and the endless tolling of church bells. The Middle Ages sounds glorious, but in reality, it smelled a lot worse than you'd ever imagine. Picture this. You're walking down a street in 14th century Paris. Wooden houses line both sides, cramped and crooked, their upper floors jutting out like they're about to collapse onto you. Beneath your feet, no sidewalks, no sewers. Just a thick, bubbling stew of mud, trash, fish bones, and, let's just say, everything people didn't feel like keeping indoors because honestly they didn't even have bathrooms. People simply opened their windows, shouted, "Watch out below," and dumped it. That wasn't a joke, it was an unspoken law shared by thousands crammed into medieval cities. The smell, let's not even start. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your dreams. But to them, that was normal, the scent of life. Every morning, the sound of church bells would echo across town, a sacred melody announcing a new day. People believed those bells could drive away demons, disease, even death itself. But there was one thing no one dared say. Those same bells were also the sound of the plague returning. Because every time someone died, the bells rang, and in the darkest years they almost never stopped. Yet amid all that chaos, people still lived, still believed in something greater, whether it was God, miracles, or simply the hope of not stepping in something disgusting today. In that world, the only light came from smoky oil torches, flickering and foul. Every street had a night watchman. But forget the swords or spears of fairy tales, these guys carried sticks and buckets of water, just in case a fire broke out, because those wooden homes could go up in flames with a single spark. The medieval night wasn't romantic. It was cold, dark, and filled with the sound of rats scurrying across rooftops. And yet, in that darkness, there was something that kept people telling stories about it. Maybe because that age showed humans at their truest, terrified, brave, foolish, and magnificent all at once. A farmer could toil his entire life without knowing his king's name, yet still believe he was upholding the divine order of the world. A noble could confess his sins in the morning and behead someone by afternoon without blinking. And priests? They were healers, judges, and managers of fear. In those days, everything was tied to God's will. The rain, the famine, who lived and who died. And that's what made the medieval world both terrifying and fascinating. Because in an era where every question was answered with faith, people never stopped searching for the truth about themselves. If you lived then, you'd see no knight's armor ever stayed clean, no princess ever waited eternally in her tower. They were dirty, scared, hungry, and dreamers just like us. The Middle Ages, in the end, weren't just a chapter in history, but a mirror reflecting what it means to be human. A time when light wasn't strong enough to chase away the dark, but strong enough to make people believe tomorrow was worth reaching for. So next time you gaze at an ancient castle and think, it must have been beautiful back then, remember behind those thick stone walls were mold, coughs, and dreams of a cleaner world. Yet it was in that very mud that Europe grew up and history wrote its next chapter. And that, truly, is the part of the story they never told you. No electric lights, no clattering carriages, not even the laughter of drunks from a tavern. The medieval city at night was an entirely different world. Everything was swallowed by darkness, lit only by the dim glow of a church torch or a candle flickering on the window of a wealthy home. But that light wasn't warm, it trembled, weak and frail, as if the wind could devour it at any moment. Can you imagine what you'd hear walking down a medieval street? The squelch of boots in mud, the clank of rusty metal, the wailing of cats in alleys, and sometimes the distant toll of a church bell echoing like God's reminder in the cold night. People believed the bells not only told time but kept away evil spirits, so on stormy nights or during plagues, the bells would ring almost endlessly. That metallic sound echoed across damp rooftops, slipped through narrow windows, and crept into the dreams of villagers. They'd wake in the dark, make the sign of the cross, then try to fall back asleep hoping the bells would stop, because they never meant good news. Daytime wasn't much better. The streets bustled, but not with the scent of fresh bread or flowers, only horse dung, wood smoke, and unwashed skin. Underfoot, a thick stew of mud, garbage, rotten fish, and everything people disposed of out the window. In that scene, people walked by without complaint. They were used to it, born into it, raised in it, and most likely, destined to die in it. To the medieval soul, the city was a living creature, one that both fed and tortured them. Every street, every church bell, was a vein in the body of a beast called life. No one dared stray too far, because beyond the walls lay the forests, the wild animals, and the darker place where no one could hear their prayers. So amid the stench of mud and smoke, they lived, laughed, and told stories. Children ran barefoot through the marketplace, muddy and giggling. Women hauled buckets of water, sighing that God is testing us. And the men drunk in the alehouse told war stories about battles they'd never fought. Each person carried the same belief, that their hard life, no matter how miserable, was God's will. They didn't ask, why? They only asked, when will God have mercy on us? And when the rain came cold and seeping through their leaky roofs, they'd stand under the eaves, hold out a hand to catch a few drops, and whisper, "Thank you, Lord. At least today we have clean water." But don't think those days were all gloom. In the darkness there was still light, the light of faith, of music, of stories. When night fell, villagers gathered around fires to hear the old storyteller speak of saints, miracles, and demons trapped inside church bells. His voice low and rough, the firelight dancing on his wrinkled face, everyone held their breath. The medieval night was a night of fear, but also of imagination. In that flickering glow, they didn't just listen to stories, they lived them. Maybe that's why even now, when we speak of the Middle Ages, we still feel a chill. Because even after centuries, the sounds of that time still echo the bells, the rain on rooftops, the calls of merchants in the dawn mist. Every sound is a fragment of its soul, and if one night you wander through an old European village shrouded in fog, you might just hear a distant bell, not from any modern church, but from somewhere far older, from a time when humanity lived closer to the dark than to the light. And when you do, you'll understand the medieval world never truly vanished. It's only sleeping beneath the heavy mist of time, waiting for someone, maybe you, to awaken it again with your imagination. If you think medieval people lived in romantic castles, bathed in perfume, and wore clean clothes, sorry, you've been watching too many movies. In reality, bathing back then was considered a rather suspicious act. People believed water opened the pores, and that's when demons and diseases could slip into the body. So many preferred to stink rather than let the angel of death breathe on them. Some people bathed only a few times in their entire lives, and each occasion was treated like a major event, a wedding, or a funeral. Clean water wasn't easy to find, and for most commoners, there was only one option: the river, the same place where they washed clothes, rinsed vegetables, and sometimes scattered the ashes of the dead. So if you ever met a medieval person who smelled natural, that scent was really a blend of sweat, smoke, mud, and a few things we probably shouldn't name. Monks and priests even encouraged people not to bathe. They said cleaning the body meant nothing, because it is the soul, not the skin, that must be washed. Bathing too often was seen as vanity, something done only by the sinful, like those southerners in cities of vice, who supposedly needed water to cleanse their guilt. Instead of soap, they used herbs, oils, or simply added more perfume to mask the smell. In big cities like Paris or London, there were public bathhouses, but they weren't like spas. They were more like noisy taverns, messy and crowded, sometimes doubling as places for activities the church strongly disapproved of. Eventually, many towns banned bathhouses altogether, claiming they led people into temptation. The result? Even fewer baths, and the smell only grew deeper. The nobles were a bit better off. They could afford wet cloths, perfumes, and clean clothes more often, though often meant once every few weeks. Some noble women even bragged they hadn't touched water in years, saying, "God gave me my own scent." For peasants, bathing was a luxury. They worked the fields from dawn to dusk, and when it rained, that counted as free bathing day. A summer downpour could turn into a rare joy, the whole village running out laughing, washing off the dirt, then heading home for dinner by the fire, smelling of smoke and fresh sweat. Strangely enough, despite not bathing, they stayed healthy. Maybe avoiding dirty water actually kept them safer than those who sought to be too clean. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some scholars wrote that water is God's gift, and that humans should use it to purify themselves. But when the church declared such thoughts dangerous, those who promoted bathing were branded heretics. You see, in those days, bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was a political statement. A man who bathed often could be seen as rebelling against God's order, while the one who smelled was considered humble. So if you travelled back to the 13th century and walked through a marketplace, don't wonder why no one minds the air smelling like a stable. They didn't just accept it, they took pride in it. To them, body odour was proof of hard work, loyalty and faith. And in a world where the soul mattered more than flesh, enduring one's own smell was almost an act of devotion. Yet beneath the layers of grime and skin untouched by soap, there was still something deeply human. When night fell, villagers gathered around the fire, sharing hard bread, talking about crops, wars, and miracles. The smell didn't separate them, it united them. They didn't need perfume to belong, just warmth and laughter. Perhaps that's why, for all its filth and roughness, the Middle Ages had its own strange beauty, a beauty not born of perfection, but of endurance. And maybe, in our spotless modern world, obsessed with cleanliness and image, we should remember this. There was once a time when people lived, loved, and believed in God without ever needing to smell good. If you were born a medieval peasant, your meals would look nothing like the lavish feasts painted in history books. No roasted meats, no shimmering red wine, no long tables covered in white cloth, just one big pot of soup so thin you could see the bottom when you stirred it. Food back then was the clearest reflection of class. Nobles ate like kings, while commoners ate like they were finishing the last chapter of life before turning into fertilizer for the next harvest. For the poor, bread was life itself. But not the soft, warm kind we know today. It was hard, dry, sometimes mixed with sawdust, sand, or tree bark to save flour. Some said if you threw a medieval loaf at a wall, the wall would crack before the bread did. The soup wasn't much better, just water boiled with wild greens, maybe a few swollen barley grains and some old bones to add flavour. And old bones meant ones that had been boiled and reboiled so many times they had nothing left but the smell of ashes. Meat? That was a distant dream. Only nobles ate it regularly. For peasants, it was a once-a-year miracle if they were lucky. Some even claimed that eating too much meat was sinful because it made the body greedy. But really, they said that mostly because they didn't have any meat to begin with. In the cold months, life got harsher. Vegetables stopped growing, milk curdled, bread moulded, and fish, if caught, usually rotted before reaching the village. So people learned to eat whatever they could chew. Some villagers survived winters on ground bark and bitter roots. Others roasted their old leather shoes just to fill their stomachs. And yet, they lived. They went to church, prayed, and believed God would feed them if not in this life, then in the next. Meanwhile, in the castles, nobles held grand feasts. Roasted piglets, stuffed geese, honey-glazed carp, even peacock heads and grilled songbirds. Every dish was a symbol of power, the stranger, the rarer, the more impressive. They ate with their hands, wiped their mouths on shared cloths, and believed burping loudly was a compliment to the cook. Between those two worlds stood the monks. They ate better than peasants because monasteries had land, gardens, and beer. But they also fasted many days a year. since church law forbade meat during prayer periods. The result? Their menu often came down to bean soup and hard bread. Still, don't pity them, they had a clever loophole. Fish didn't count as meat. So, on strict fasting days, monks feasted on fish, clams, crabs, and snails guilt-free. Medieval people truly believed that eating wasn't just survival. It was a statement of virtue and status. The rich ate richly to prove God's blessing, while the poor ate humbly to prove God's testing. Every meal was a sermon, and hunger itself became holy. Yet they still found joy in the little things. After harvest, whole villages celebrated. They sang, drank weak beer, and danced around bonfires. No meat, just bread, potatoes, and laughter shared like treasure. Some children had never tasted meat, but they laughed anyway because they didn't know what they were missing. And maybe that's why they carried less weight in their hearts than we do. Look back now, and you'll see the irony. The Middle Ages were poor and filthy, yet people were grateful for what little they had. They ate mouldy bread and felt blessed, while we dine in luxury and still feel hollow. Their food was survival but also faith, because as long as they could share it, even the hungriest meal still had sweetness. And perhaps that's the one flavor modern life has forgotten. If you lived in medieval Europe, you'd quickly notice something strange. Everyone drank beer, even children. Sounds like a joke, but it was actually the only way to survive. Water back then was more dangerous than alcohol. Streams, rivers, and wells were easily contaminated with waste, dead animals, and human filth no one bothered to clean up. Drinking plain water was the fastest way to invite disease into your home, so people turned to beer, the lesser evil. But don't imagine they were drunk all day. Medieval beer wasn't as strong as what we have now. It was a light brew, low in alcohol, called small beer, just enough to kill bacteria in the water, but not enough to make you sing the wrong psalms. Beer was seen as food, not booze. People drank it instead of water every single day, morning, noon, and night. Peasants drank it in the fields, monks drank it for breakfast, and children were given a sip to grow strong. In monasteries, there were even specific rules for how much beer each monk could have per day, and the number might shock you. Some monasteries allowed up to 5 liters. But don't picture them stumbling around drunk. For them, beer wasn't a pleasure. It was part of their diet. It contained grain, yeast, and water, what they called liquid bread. The poor brewed beer at home using whatever they had: barley, oats, herbs, sometimes honey, to cover the sourness. Nobles, of course, drank richer beer, flavoured with expensive spices like nutmeg or cinnamon. In the monasteries, brewing became an art, even a form of prayer. Every batch of beer was a product of patience, discipline, and, as they said, God's will. Monks believed beer keeps the humble closer to the Holy Spirit than wine keeps the proud. Sounds poetic. But truth be told, they were also savvy businessmen. They sold beer to villagers in exchange for food, cloth, or donations. It's no coincidence that some of Europe's richest monasteries rose on the foam of their brews. One of the best stories goes that when the Pope heard monks were drinking beer all through Lent, he grew suspicious and had a barrel shipped to Rome for inspection. By the time it arrived, the beer had spoiled bitter and foul. The Pope tasted it and said, "If they can drink this as penance, they surely deserve forgiveness." And so, the monks kept drinking in peace. Beer didn't just save lives, it built communities. Every village had at least one brewer, the brewmaster. Their house was the heart of the town, where people gathered to drink, gossip, and plan the next festival. On cold nights, steam rose from the big wooden vats, the smell of malt filled the room, and laughter echoed through clinking clay mugs. It was one of the few joys in a harsh life. Children didn't get drunk, but they were never thirsty. Mothers handed them little mugs of beer, saying, "Drink, my child, and you'll grow strong like your father." And so, the whole family drank and no one thought it was wrong. In fact, there was a saying back then, "He who drinks water dies, he who drinks beer lives." It sounded like an ad slogan, but to them, it was truth. Still, not everyone was pleased. Some pious folk called beer the devil's temptation. They warned, "He who laughs too loud at the beer table will soon cry in church." But for the poor, in the freezing winters, one warm gulp of beer meant more than a sermon. It dulled the hunger, eased the cold, and sometimes made them feel alive. In the Middle Ages, beer wasn't just a drink, it was survival, it was community. It was faith proof that even in a world as bitter as theirs, people could still find a little sweetness. So next time you raise a glass, remember somewhere, centuries ago, a peasant might have done the same, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. At least this water's safe to drink." Dating in the Middle Ages had no roses, scented candles, or sweet little love notes. The only thing you could give someone you liked was a healthy sheep or a loaf of bread that hadn't gone mouldy yet. In a world where marriage was a game of land and bloodlines, romantic love was almost a privilege reserved for poetry. In real life, dating meant sweat, mud, and the constant supervision of the entire village. In the countryside, boys and girls weren't allowed to get to know each other freely. Love had to go through parents, landowners, even the parish priest. If you showed the slightest sign of liking someone, by morning, the whole village would already be talking. But don't think they lacked romance, they just had their own way. Every year during festivals, young people gathered in the village square. They sang, danced, and played innocent games like apple tossing, hand pulling, or hiding scarves. In that crowd, if two people locked eyes for more than 3 beats, it was said they were enchanted. Affection bloomed not through words but through stolen glances, the brush of a hand while passing bread, or a shy smile flickering in the firelight of a village feast. For the poor, marriage was about survival. A girl didn't marry for love, she married because the man's family had land. A boy didn't wed out of passion, he needed someone to cook, farm, and bear children. Yet even in arranged marriages, there were moments when they'd look at each other, laugh shyly, and love would quietly take root. The nobles, though, lived differently. Their love was wrapped in gold but bound by ritual. Marriages between noble houses were political tools. A princess could be married off to a distant prince she'd never met. And if she dared to love someone beneath her station, she might as well sign her own sentence. Tales tell of noble women who ran away with knights, only to be caught and locked away for life. Yet, ironically, within those cold stone castles, love was praised the loudest. Musicians sang of it, poets wrote about it, and knights considered love the purest virtue. To love is to serve, to love is to become greater. They called it courtly love, where a man loved with loyalty, not desire. But don't be fooled, desire was never absent. Those same romantic ballads were sung inside halls where banquets and secret affairs were far more common than prayers. Among common folk, love was tangled with faith. They had strange rituals, burning leaves under their pillows to dream of their beloved, or dropping ribbons into sacred wells, believing whoever found them was fated by God. Some even sought out love witches, old women who brewed charms from honey, chicken blood, and bone ash, promising that the person they longed for would turn and look. But love back then could be dangerous. If a woman was caught cheating, she might have her head shaved, be paraded through the marketplace, or worse, burned. Men, on the other hand, were easily forgiven as long as they held status. That world was never fair, but love still found its way stubborn, wild, like weeds growing through stone. In small villages, secret loves bloomed between people who had nothing but hope. A young man left a leather strap at a girl's door, a silent promise. She replied with an old wool scarf, knitted through the winter nights. No words were spoken, yet everything was understood. When they finally married, there were no white dresses, no music, only church bells and curious eyes. But when their hands met, that smile that was the truest thing in the world. To us today, their lives might seem harsh. But really, they loved more simply than anyone who came after, not for pretty words or perfect pictures, but because it was all they had to give each other in a cold, hard world. And maybe, one night at a festival, under the sound of laughter and the flicker of fire, there were two people who met eyes, said nothing yet in that look. You could see an entire era where love was forbidden, and still, the only miracle even God couldn't stop. If you ever thought that the beauty standards of the Middle Ages were all about fair-haired princesses with rosy cheeks and full figures like in paintings, well, sorry, reality was far stranger than you imagine. Beauty back then wasn't like today, and sometimes it makes modern people wonder, Did they really think that was beautiful? In their world, beauty wasn't just about looks. It was a symbol of virtue, class, and devotion. A woman was considered beautiful, not because she was alluring, but because she looked pure, more like an angel than a real person. Pale, milk-white skin was the standard, because it showed you didn't work under the Sunday. People even rubbed lead powder on their faces to look whiter, despite their skin blistering and peeling off. The paler you were, the more noble you seemed. A high forehead was also a sign of intelligence and refinement, so much so that many women plucked or shaved the hair from their foreheads to make them look taller. From afar, they looked like they were wearing a white crescent moon on their heads, both strange and a little frightening. It didn't stop there. Eyebrows and eyelashes were considered vulgar. People believed a woman's ideal face should be smooth like wax, with nothing growing in the wrong place. So many noble ladies used hot beeswax or blades to remove their eyebrows, the very thing we now spend money to draw back on. Lips were supposed to be thin, never red, because red symbolized sin and desire. They preferred pale lips, sometimes dusted with white powder, mixed with ash to dull the natural color. And the body shape? Forget the slim-waisted fairy tale look. The ideal medieval woman was round, soft and blessed, because thinness was a sign of sickness or poverty. Men, on the other hand, had their own standards. Tanned skin and a sturdy build showed strength but not too much dirt. Long hair, neat beards, and calloused hands meant you were trustworthy. Meanwhile, nobles worked hard to keep their skin porcelain white, because labour was for the commoners. Among the upper class, they wore velvet, gloves to block the sun, and heavy perfumes to cover the smell of being human. In cities, the first cosmetic shops appeared, and they were anything but safe. They sold powders mixed with lead, skin treatments laced with mercury, and perfumes made from dead animals. Many went blind, developed sores, or were poisoned, all in the name of looking more divine. And if you think only women cared about beauty, think again. Noblemen were no different. They curled their hair, wore perfume, dressed in tight tunics to show off their bodies, and even powdered their faces to look healthy and blessed. Mirrors were a luxury, so people relied on others' compliments to know how beautiful they were. Flattery became a survival skill, a social art form. People learned to lie gracefully. Someone might praise a lady as radiant as a saint, while secretly coughing from the cloud of lead dust coming off her hair. But beauty wasn't just about appearance. It was tied to morality. An unattractive face was seen as God's disfavour, or worse, a mark of sin. Women with unusual features were sometimes accused of witchcraft, tortured for having eyes too deep or teeth too sharp. Looks didn't just decide love, they decided life. The more pure you appeared, the safer you were. And anyone who strayed from that ideal even slightly might pay with their life. Yet, within that dark world of twisted beauty standards, some resisted. Records tell of women in Venice who removed their veils, let their hair show, even painted their lips red, defying the rules. They were called arrogant demons, but they were the first pioneers of the right to be themselves. So, if you ever see a medieval painting of a pale face, high forehead, thin lips, and sad eyes, remember, it wasn't just how they painted, it was how they saw the world. A place where beauty was bound to fear, where people had to make themselves holy just to be accepted. And maybe, somewhere in a dim, candlelit room, a woman once looked into a basin of water and whispered, "Dear God, if I am this beautiful, am I allowed to love?" When death swept across Europe in the 14th century, people didn't call it a plague, they called it the wrath of God. Because no one could believe something invisible, something as tiny as a germ, could kill millions. All they knew was that this morning their neighbour was laughing, and by nightfall they were a swollen, purple corpse, reeking of decay. They didn't understand why they only knew how to pray. Church bells rang endlessly, incense filled the air, and the sound of repentance echoed through the streets. They believed God was punishing humanity for its sins, and every soul that died was a reminder of how far the world had fallen. The plague, what we now call the Black Death, tore through Europe like a storm from hell. 1 in 3 people died. Streets overflowed with corpses. There weren't enough living to bury the dead. Whole villages vanished within weeks. No one knew where it came from. only that wherever ships arrived, death followed. But instead of looking for answers, medieval people looked to the sky. They believed this was God's fury, and to calm it, they did the only thing they knew: repent. Groups of men whipped themselves bloody, marching from town to town, chanting prayers, believing that if they suffered for mankind, God might forgive. It was horrifying and heartbreaking: torn flesh, hollow eyes, blind faith. In every corner of every city, priests performed funerals until, one by one, they too fell. In some towns the dead were burned together, their smoke rising in thick black clouds that turned day into night. The stench of death mixed with incense and pine resin until holiness and despair became one. And as always, when fear overcomes reason, people found someone to blame. Witches, foreigners, Jews. They said these people had poisoned the wells and brought death upon the world. The hunts began. Thousands of innocents were hanged, burned, or drowned, all in the name of purifying sin. But death kept coming, hour after hour. Some died praying, some collapsed in the market. Some died alone at home, rosaries still clutched in their hands. The plague spared no one, noble or peasant, priest or soldier. It came like the wind unseen, merciless, cold. When priests were gone and doctors knew nothing but prayer, people turned to magic. They hung garlic on their doors, burned herbs, smeared ashes on their skin, or wore iron crosses as charms. Some believed carrying gemstones would make God recognize them and spare them. Others hid underground, locking themselves away, waiting for the wrath to pass. But amid the chaos, some survived. They crawled out of the ashes, trembling, staring at the ruins of the world, and asked, "Why did God choose me?" There was no answer. Yet from that question, Europe began to change. People no longer believed everything was simply God's will. They began to doubt, to question, to ask, why? And from the ashes of the Black Death, the first sparks of the Enlightenment were born when humanity realized that sometimes salvation doesn't come from the heavens, but from their own minds. But in that moment, they didn't know that yet. All they knew was the world was no longer the same. The church bells still rang, but they no longer brought comfort. They sounded like the tolling of lost souls. And when the wind blew across the empty fields where once thriving villages had stood, people said they could hear the voices of the dead singing of faith, of fear, and of a time when mankind knelt beneath the shadow of God, trembling for forgiveness that would never come. There was one profession that can make modern people shiver just by hearing its name: the medieval healer. Don't mistake them for the ancestors of today's doctors. They were more like a mix between alchemists and sorcerers. When someone got sick, medieval people didn't think of bacteria. They thought of sin, the stars, and the imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour represented one of nature's elements: earth, water, fire, air, and healers believed illness came when one of them rebelled. So the only cure was to restore balance, most often by letting blood. A patient had a fever? Cut the arm. A cough? Cut the wrist. Depression? Maybe bleed the leg. People believed the more blood you lost, the more sickness left your body. In truth, most just grew weaker or recovered permanently. The best healers were called God's physicians, while the frauds called themselves listeners of souls. Medicine was as chaotic as the world itself. They brewed potions from anything they believed held power: snake blood, ashes of the dead, graveyard herbs, bear bile, and sometimes the urine of children. The smell of their chambers was more witchcraft than hospital. The sick lay in herbal smoke, hearing prayers mixed with the wind, while the healer poured thick mixtures down their throats and whispered, "God will do the rest." Not all were fools. Some monks truly studied plants, kept records, and created remedies still known today: chamomile, rosemary, honey as antiseptic. But most knowledge was shackled by religion. Dissection was forbidden, for the body was sacred. So, anatomical research happened secretly, in monastery basements, where a few brave souls dared open the bodies of criminals to understand human flesh. If caught, they'd burn for offending God. Meanwhile, holy remedies spread among villagers creative, if nothing else. Fever? Wear dried snake skin around your neck. Heart pain? Drink ground dog teeth. Headache? Stick a live frog on your forehead to suck out bad air. The stranger it was, the more people believed, because in desperation, faith was all they had left. Yet, amid the madness, there was something fascinating. Without science, medieval medicine became a strange mix of knowledge, superstition, and art. The healer didn't just cure. He comforted, told stories, prayed for his patients. Sometimes faith alone made people actually feel better. A miracle? Or just the mind? No one knew, and no one cared. In a world where life and death were a single breath apart, understanding mattered less than hope. Still, there was a darker side. Medical witches preyed on fear for profit. They sold potions made from human bones, claiming whoever drinks will be blessed by God. They swore a bag of a saint's fingernails worn on your neck could heal all illness. People believed, sold everything they owned, and died faithful. In cities, educated doctors weren't much better. Their methods were brutal. Red-hot irons to burn away sickness, or drilling tiny holes in the skull to release bad air. Hard to imagine, but those horrors paved the first steps toward modern medicine. Wrong, yes, but they taught mankind to question nature instead of fearing it. Among all those bizarre remedies, one thing was seen as divine medicine: wine. It was used to disinfect, to numb pain, and to find courage. When they cut, they drank. When they gave birth, they drank. When someone died, others drank too. In the Middle Ages, wine didn't just heal the body, it healed fear. So if you ever travelled back to those times with a cold, don't expect cough syrup or a doctor with a stethoscope. You'd get snake blood on your chest, herbal smoke in your lungs, warm wine to drink, and a healer leaning close, saying with absolute conviction, "If God wills it, you'll live. If not, I'll pray for your soul." Medieval prisons were nothing like the ones you've seen in movies. They weren't meant for rehabilitation. They were built for punishment, for power, for fear. When someone said thrown into the dungeon, it usually meant they'd never walk out again. Or if they did, they wouldn't be whole. The cells were deep underground, damp, dark, and foul enough to make you gag within minutes. Mold on the walls, lice on the floor, rats crawling across your body, and rainwater dripping steadily like the ticking of death. Torture wasn't always necessary. Just being there for days could break a person's mind. But if God didn't work fast enough, humans had their own ways. Torture devices were considered proof of divine justice, cold, merciless, and terrifyingly creative. There were iron chairs studded with spikes, wheels that shattered bones joint by joint, and cages hung in the market square so the sun and the crows could finish the job. Interrogation. Oh, that wasn't about finding truth, it was a ritual to prove God hates sin. Rebels, witches, thieves, all could be dragged into the square for the crowd to purify themselves through fear. And the crowd always came. They didn't look away. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders cheering as blades met flesh. Some clapped when the condemned confessed. Not because they were cruel, but because they believed this was how the world stayed right. In those days, punishment wasn't just about pain, it was a lesson. A bread thief might lose a hand. A man who insulted the king might lose his tongue. A heretic was burned alive in the square. They called it the light of God's justice. And strangely, many confessed even when innocent, believing pain would cleanse their souls. Priests sat beside them, praying over the blood, convinced they were watching God wash away mankind's sins. In other places, prisons were tools of politics. Enemies of the crown rotted in cold towers, starved until they forgot what day it was. Some were chained so long their skin fused with iron. They wrote on the walls with blood or charcoal messages to anyone who might someday read them. Centuries later, those words were still there, faded, trembling with despair. For women, the prisons looked different. They were locked in chambers of repentance, lit only by a slit of light the size of a hand. Many were accused of witchcraft, forced to confess to things they'd never done. They were drenched in freezing water in the middle of winter, or tied and thrown into rivers to prove innocence. If they sank, they were good but dead. If they floated, they were witches and burned. The only choice was how to die. Yet even in hell, some survived, some escaped, some were pardoned, some endured every pain without lying, and they became legends. People whispered that every old dungeon held one restless soul, not because it was trapped, but because it was waiting for someone to prove justice ever existed. And the people, they still believed in that justice. They believed each punishment brought them closer to salvation, that witnessing pain was how they could understand God's mercy. That was the tragedy of the age when faith became the whip and justice wore the mask of sin. But out of that cruelty, something began to stir a question, faint but powerful. Does God truly want this? That question, small as it was, became the first seed of human rights. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person daring to ask for the darkness to start to crack. Amid a world of blood and mud, there was one place that still held a faint light: the church and the monastery. There, knowledge was kept like treasure, reserved only for the chosen. Books weren't placed on open shelves for anyone to read. They were chained with iron links, locked in cold stone rooms, touched only by priests or scholars. In the Middle Ages, literacy was a privilege for the few. Most people lived and died without knowing a single letter, not because they couldn't, but because they weren't allowed to. Knowledge, like religion, was a tool of control. The church held power not only because it preached, but because it monopolized truth. Every book, every manuscript, every word had to pass through its hands. In the monasteries, monks sat for hours by candlelight, copying page after page by hand. Every letter, every line, was the work of months, and one wrong stroke could be deemed a sin against God. They called it the divine art of transcription. And indeed, within those pages, entire worlds lived: the Bible, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, even ancient texts from Greece and Arabia. But what the common people knew was only what they were allowed to hear. The church decided what was truth and what was heresy. A single idea that contradicted scripture could cost you your head. Countless works were burned, buried, rewritten to fit God's will. And those who dared to ask why, the first thinkers of the Enlightenment, often ended their lives at the stake. Meanwhile, outside the monastery, the illiterate masses lived in the shadow of faith. They didn't need to read, because the priest would read for them. They didn't need to understand, because God already did. Every service, Latin echoed through the halls like a spell, words no one understood, but everyone knelt to, believing that simply hearing them was enough for salvation. That was how knowledge became a wall, not to protect humanity, but to confine it. Yet some monks were different. They didn't just copy, they read, they thought. They began to realize the world might hold more than one truth. Some secretly hid forbidden books, passing them hand to hand in the night. They translated, studied, and slowly the first seeds of free thought began to grow outside the church walls. In one monastery in northern Italy, someone scribbled a note in the margin of a Bible: "God gives light to those who dare to open their eyes." That line would later become a symbol of intellectual freedom. And in the villages, where people couldn't read, they learned through images. The murals and stained glass of churches were their textbooks. Each picture told a story: Adam and Eve, the Savior, the devil, heaven and hell. They learned through sight, not words. But that, too, sparked something: art, flourished. In the darkness of control, human imagination still burned. They painted, carved, sang, told stories in every way they could. Perhaps that was how they fought back against a world silenced by obedience. It was also during this time that the first universities appeared, small, watched over, but proof that humanity longed to break its chains. Oxford, Bologna, Paris, names that began as gatherings of monks reading scripture, then turned into debates about philosophy, mathematics, and the nature of the world. Of course, the church disapproved, but could not stop it. They monitored, they threatened, but knowledge is like fire. The more you try to smother it, the brighter it burns. And quietly, a revolution began, not with swords, but with ink. When a young monk first saw the light shine through a page and realized he was learning something not commanded by anyone, he wrote, "I feel as though God is looking at me through the words." That was the moment humanity began to awaken. The monastery was no longer just a house of prayer, but a vault of knowledge, a place where the seeds of the future were hidden. And though the world was still dark, cracks had begun to form, preparing for the day when humankind would finally ask, if God gave us minds, wasn't it to use them? Medieval music wasn't what you hear in movies with grand choirs echoing through castles. It wasn't entirely solemn, it was alive, earthy, and filled with the scent of smoke, ale, and faith. People in the Middle Ages sang everywhere, in churches, in markets, on fields, at weddings, even during executions, because for them, sound wasn't just art, it was a way to speak to the world and to God. When you stepped into a 13th century church, you'd hear sacred music woven from human voices, no instruments, no complex melodies. They sang in Latin, repeating phrases, slow and drawn out like breathing. It was the Gregorian chant, a prayer in sound, where every voice merged into one, as if humanity vanished and only faith remained, echoing through stone and incense. They believed that in song, their souls were closer to God. But outside those monastery walls, music changed its tone. In the countryside, there were wandering singers, troubadours, travelling from place to place with lutes, hand drums, and hundreds of songs about love, war, and tragedy. They were storytellers in melody, singing of knights who rode far away, of women waiting in towers, of kings betrayed. The people didn't just listen, they lived through the songs, because most couldn't read. Music was their newspaper, their social network. Many tunes sounded cheerful, yet hid sorrow. A harvest song might praise the sun, but secretly pray for rain. A marching song for soldiers might sound triumphant, yet every drumbeat carried the heartbeats of mothers afraid to lose their sons. Even at executions, people sang not out of joy, but to guide the soul gently away. One record tells of a witch being burned while villagers sang hymns, believing they were helping her earn God's forgiveness. That sound, mingled with fire and tears, is the purest image of that era, where music was both salvation and curse. Church music and worldly music were two parallel worlds. One sang to God, the other to mankind. But sometimes they intertwined. Some composers dared to weave folk melodies into sacred hymns, angering the church. They were warned, even banished, but those melodies survived, passed from ear to ear, sneaking into prayers and ceremonies. And so, divine faith began to breathe with human life. To the medieval soul, music was also healing. They believed every sound had a spirit. A right note could ease pain, a wrong one could anger God. Healers used song to drive out illness, monks used it to calm souls, and peasants sang to forget hunger. Records tell that during the years of the Black Death, groups of people walked the streets with instruments, singing prayers for the dead. Their voices mingled with the stench of death, echoing through shuttered homes, a scene both holy and hopeless. Yet in those darkest days, music kept people from turning to stone. It reminded them they were still alive. Music was also one of the few things the rich and poor shared. A nobleman in a feast hall and a peasant in a market could sing the same song, even if the words were different. It was the one language that God, kings, and commoners all understood. And slowly, from those wandering tunes, Western music theory was born. Not in royal courts, but in taverns, in town squares, from the songs of the hungry and the faithful. So when you hear an old melody today, don't think of it as distant. In every drumbeat, in every trembling string, lives the heartbeat of people who once lived, loved, and believed in a world still cloaked in darkness. Music was the only light they had. And perhaps, when that song rose into the night, even God paused to listen. People in the Middle Ages believed in magic as deeply as they believed in God, and sometimes the two blended so completely that no one could tell where faith ended and superstition began. In a world where science had no name, every mystery was attributed to unseen forces. If crops failed, it was because demons had dried the earth. If a cow died suddenly, perhaps a neighbor was possessed. And if you got sick and the healer couldn't cure you, then surely you'd been cursed. In every village, there was always someone who knew things, usually an older woman, living apart from others, using herbs and prayers to heal, help with childbirth, or curse. People both trusted and feared her, calling her the wise woman. But as the world began to tremble under the fear of the devil, she became the hunted. Charms and spells came in many forms, from good luck amulets made of grass and bone, to bracelets tied around infants' wrists, to ward off evil spirits. Some wore pieces of human bone under their clothes, believing it protected them from disease. Others carried ashes of the dead in pouches, thinking it would repel demons. Magic wasn't just superstition, it was survival. When medicine failed, when the church stayed silent, people turned to charms because it was the only hope they had. And among the flickering candles of the night, those old women brewing herbs and whispering prayers became symbols of both fear and faith. But the church couldn't tolerate that. They declared that only God could save souls, and all magic outside the church was the language of the devil. And so, the witch hunts began. Thousands of women were accused of making pacts with Satan, simply because they knew how to heal with plants, or because they were different. Anyone with a black cat was a witch. Anyone with a mole had the mark of the devil. Anyone who lived alone was said to practice dark arts. Public trials became horrific spectacles. Women were tied and thrown into rivers. If they sank, they were innocent and dead. If they floated, they were witches and burned. All in the name of faith. Some used that fear to take revenge, steal land, or eliminate enemies. History tells of trials where dozens were condemned just for staring too long at the moon. But amid all that madness, something more terrifying appeared: the people's belief. They truly thought burning witches was righteous, a way to protect their souls from evil. No one saw themselves as cruel. They believed they were doing God's work. It was a world of contradictions. People hung holy charms to keep out demons but still wore bones just to be safe. They prayed to God in the morning, then secretly met a sorcerer at night to pray for a son. To them, religion and magic didn't conflict. They completed each other. And that's the raw truth of that time. Faith and fear were inseparable. Together, they made up the medieval soul. Yet, in that darkness, there were glimmers of light. Some truly used herbs to heal and passed that knowledge through generations. Thanks to them, herbal medicine survived to this day. They weren't witches, they were the first scientists, born too soon. But the world back then couldn't accept difference, and in the flames that consumed thousands of innocent lives, humanity also burned its own wisdom. Centuries later, when people discovered that many forbidden remedies actually worked, history began to realize that those witches had preserved a piece of human compassion in a barbaric age. So now, when you see an old charm or a painting of a woman beside a pot of herbs, remember she wasn't a monster. She was someone who chose to believe in human strength, in a time when everyone else knelt before fear. And perhaps it was they, not kings or priests, who truly understood what magic really meant. If you lived in the Middle Ages and thought farming was too boring, don't worry, that world had enough bizarre jobs to make you both horrified and amused. Some people specialized in collecting the teeth of the executed, plucking them one by one from corpses, and selling them to jewelers or healers to make charms or, believe it or not, premium dentures. In the black market, a bright white tooth from a beheaded man could fetch the price of a sheep. People believed the teeth of the dead carried powerful souls that could protect the living from illness. So, tooth hunters became a real profession, working mostly around gallows, armed with leather pouches, iron pliers, and nerves of steel. But that wasn't the strangest. There were also people who sold holy bathwater. Of course, no saint ever actually bathed. They just drew water from church wells, added flowers, candles, and a few prayers, then sold it with the claim, "Just one drop, and your soul will be cleansed of sin for 3 days." Strangely enough, people believed it. Many nobles spent fortunes buying those sacred bottles, while the poor diluted and shared them, hoping for partial salvation. Meanwhile, some folks made a living as angel footprint finders. They roamed the countryside searching for odd indentations on rocks and proclaimed, "This is where an angel landed." Villagers would then come to worship, toss coins, and just like that, the finder earned himself a hearty meal. There was also the miracle inspector. Whenever someone claimed to see a crying statue, a cross-shaped loaf of bread, or blood seeping from wood, the church sent an expert to verify it. Many of these men became wealthy because if they declared a miracle genuine, the site turned into a pilgrimage destination for a fee, of course. But if it was deemed fake, the creator could be hanged. A profession both lucrative and deadly, gambling with the faith of an entire world. Then there were jobs that sounded harmless but were haunting, like the body spinner. When someone died, The family had to hire someone to spin the corpse around the house 3 times so the spirit wouldn't lose its way and return. Crazy as it sounds, they believed wandering souls could possess the living. There was also the death bell keeper. When plague spread and monks were too exhausted, villagers were paid to ring the death bell each time someone passed. The bells tolled through the night, their echoes filling the fog, and some said if you listened long enough, you'd start to feel your own call. And then came the jobs drenched in blood. The blade tester, someone tasked with checking the sharpness of execution swords by slicing into a corpse. If the blade didn't cut clean in one strike, the tester was punished for offending justice. Or the skull keeper, the person who guarded the severed heads of criminals, labeling each with name and crime, and storing them until their power faded. Collections of skulls were believed to pass strength to future generations. In big cities like London and Paris, there were even blood sellers. They drained animal blood, mixed it with wine, and cried out, "Drink, and you'll be strong as an ox." Many did, and died strong indeed. And of course, there was the waste catcher. Sounds like a joke, but since public toilets were rare, wealthy families hired people to catch their waste in buckets and carry it away to fertilize fields. Sometimes, that was the only way the poor could survive trading stench for supper. In the Middle Ages, everything had value, even what you threw away. All those jobs sound absurd now, but they perfectly reflected the spirit of that era, a world tangled between faith, poverty, and fear, where people would do anything to survive, even sell belief, corpses, or what no one dared touch. And perhaps among them were those who truly believed they were doing good, helping souls ascend, or blessing others with holy water. So when we look back, we can laugh or shudder, but we should also understand they weren't mad, they were just living in a world where reason hadn't yet found its place. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful and brutal truth of the Middle Ages. If you ever thought knights were the perfect heroes, charming, brave, and smelling nice like in fairy tales, you're in for a disappointment. In reality, they were tough warriors, but they smelled bad and were usually covered in blood. That shiny armor you see in museums? Back then, it wasn't so shiny, caked with mud, sweat and rust, coated with animal fat to keep out water. A knight's armor could weigh up to 30 kilos, and to put it on, they needed at least 2 helpers. Taking it off was even harder, especially after battle, when sweat and blood had dried stiff. Some stories say people had to use knives to pry the skin off the steel, because the armor had fused with the flesh. You think they rode gallantly across green fields? Not really most of the time. They trudged through mud, forests, and corpses. War horses weren't for show either. They were trained to kick, ram, even bite enemies. One kick from a war horse could kill a man instantly. Yet those who rode them, the knights, lived a strange paradox. They fought for glory and honor, but their lives were anything but glorious. On the battlefield, they were like living machines sealed from head to toe, gasping for air. And when they fell, many couldn't stand back up. There's a story of a knight who fell on his back and suffocated inside his armor because no one heard his cries over the drums of war. And don't think they were all gentlemen. Off the battlefield, they could be legal bandits. During wartime, stealing from the enemy was considered spoils blessed by God. Many knights survived by raiding villages, burning homes to intimidate people, and demanding ransom. In other words, they were licensed heroes with permission to sin. Yet in songs, they were praised as protectors of justice. A travelling bard could turn a butcher into a symbol of loyalty, just add a few fancy words and a lute. At feasts after battles, they were treated like gods. Roasted meat, beer, bread, and the stench of sweat that no one dared complain about, because who would criticize someone who could slice you in half with one swing? And despite their glory, they were still bound by their lords. A knight wasn't a free man, he was the king's mobile property, summoned at any time, even if sick or about to marry. Some had to fight as mercenaries to pay off debts, becoming wandering knights. And don't assume they always won. Many died from colds or being crushed by their own horses. Here's something few mention. Beneath that steel armor, they wore thick linen padding, soaked with sweat, urine, and sometimes their own blood. Washing it daily? Not a chance. The smell alone could knock you out if you stood too close. Yet despite all that, knights remain the symbol of their age, not because they were perfect, but because they embodied humanity's oldest desire: to fight, to protect, and to find meaning in a dark world. So, when you hear of the glory of warriors, remember, behind every shield were trembling hands, beneath every helmet was a weary face, and under every shining plate was a scarred body. They weren't saints, just people trying to survive in a time when honor was measured in blood, and loyalty could be bought with a bag of gold. So next time you see a knight statue standing tall in a square, bow your head not for their grandeur, but for the suffering they carried inside that heavy armor. The Middle Ages weren't just the story of knights and warriors. It was also a world where a woman's fate was bound by beliefs she could never escape. If you were born a girl, your path was almost already written: become a wife, bear children, and pray to give birth to a son. In that society, having a boy was seen as God's blessing, while having a girl meant you needed to pray harder. When a woman gave birth, the first child determined her worth in the household. If it was a boy, the church bells rang, neighbours came to celebrate, and beer and bread were shared. But if it was a girl, silence filled the room, followed only by whispers of "God will bless her next time." In many noble families, daughters' names were even left out of family records, as if they had never existed. Peasant women fared no better. They worked as hard as men, fetching water, tilling soil, washing clothes, raising children, yet no one called it labour worth honouring. If they were weak or sick, it was said their faith in God wasn't strong enough. Worse, if a wife couldn't have children, she was believed to be cursed. Some were abandoned by their husbands, others were sent to convents to live out their days in silence. And beautiful women they had even more to fear. Their looks could be used against them. If a man desired them or envied them, it was said they had used witchcraft to seduce. Back then, being called a witch was as easy as breathing. If you could read, write, or dared to argue with a man, that was enough to tie you to a stake. And the most terrifying part? People believed it was justice. Medieval women lived between two fires: devotion and suspicion. They were taught to be humble, silent, and enduring. In church, they were told women were the cause of sin because Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit. Yet they were the ones who kept the world alive, baking bread, weaving cloth, keeping homes, teaching children, and tending the sick. During wars, when men were gone, it was women who ploughed the fields so villages wouldn't starve. But when peace returned, glory went to the men, and women went back to the kitchen. Among the nobles, women were trained in manners, music, and how to smile just enough to not seem crude. They might be muses in poetry, but in reality, they were bargaining chips in political marriages. There were brides of 13, wrapped in heavy gowns, sent off to faraway lands where husbands were called lords. Yet, even in that harsh world, some women shone like torches not through power, but through intellect and courage. They were nuns who wrote books when women weren't allowed to hold pens, mothers who hid their children in forests when soldiers invaded, healers who saved lives with herbs while the church called it witchcraft. They weren't written into history, but their names lived on in lullabies and folk songs passed down through generations. And strangely, despite the scorn, women of that era kept their dignity in their eyes, burned a strength no age could crush: patience. Because in a world of violence and power, they were the ones who sustained life. They had no swords, but they had hands that kept the fire alive through the cold, lullabies that drowned out funeral bells, and love that outlasted faith. Perhaps without those women, the Middle Ages would have collapsed much sooner. So, when we speak of the age of knights and kings, don't forget the women behind the kitchen doors, behind altars, and between the nameless lines of history. Because they, not the men in armour, were the true heart of that age. In the Middle Ages, children didn't have a childhood the way we understand it today. The moment they were strong enough to hold a shovel or a spoon, they were pulled into the endless cycle of responsibility, labour, and expectation. A 7-year-old was already considered a small adult working in the fields, helping his father plough, or following his mother to sell goods at the market. There was no such thing as going to school. For most people, learning was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, or for those sent to monasteries, where knowledge came with strict discipline and beatings in the name of God. Some children were forced into trades very early: blacksmithing, weaving, serving, even soldier training. Their childhoods had no toys, only tools. In the cities, children sold goods, carried messages, or knocked on doors begging for food chased away more often than they were pitied. In the countryside, they ate from the same pot as adults, slept in the same barns as animals, and believed life wasn't much different from the oxen ploughing beside them. The so-called dreamy years simply didn't exist. People believed children were just undeveloped adults. By 12, many girls were married. Many boys wore armor and went to war. At an age when we dream of classrooms, they had already seen blood, war, and death. Orphans from plague and war were sold as slaves, sent to noble houses as servants or decoration. Some boys were forced to become court jesters made to entertain, until their voices broke while girls were turned into ornaments for banquets. For them, laughter wasn't joy, it was duty. Yet, even in that darkness, there were small sparks of happiness. Children gathered after work to play games, throwing stones, jumping over ditches, chasing each other through the fields. They sang folk songs and told tales of dragons, demons, and knights trying to forget hunger for a while. Some even believed in miracles, that if they found a 4-leaf clover, they could escape servitude. But miracles were rare, and time never waited. One day they were running free, the next they were bowing to a landlord. Disease was another enemy. With no medicine, no real doctors, children died of colds, hunger, or infected wounds. In many villages, this was accepted as normal. When a child died, few wept, they said. God has only taken back what he lent. But the worst thing was indifference. A dying child by the road might be left there, because everyone was too busy surviving. The world was too harsh to make room for compassion. Yet somehow, in that suffering, people learned resilience early. A 10-year-old boy could sharpen a sword, start a fire, hunt rabbits, and defend his siblings from thieves. A 9-year-old girl could bake bread, mend clothes, and help her mother give birth. They grew up without realizing they had ever been children. And perhaps it was that loss that made later generations dream of childhood, something the Middle Ages never had. But don't think it was all bleak. In small villages, you might still see a group of children singing by a well, or laughing when the first snow fell. Their joy was brief, but real, a flicker of warmth in the winter night. They didn't need wooden toys, just a crust of bread, a branch to play with, or a distant dream of the future, one without war, without chains, with freedom. Maybe that's what medieval children taught the world, that even in its darkest age, humanity still knew how to laugh, to dream, and to hope, even if only for a moment. And perhaps those forgotten children, lost between the lines of history, were the truest proof of mankind's resilience. But then, amid the laughter, the beer, and the mud of the festivals, something else began to creep in. Something that would change all of Europe forever. Knowledge. In the 15th century, inside cold monasteries where candlelight trembled over handwritten pages, people began to whisper about a new invention, something called the printing press. Before that, books were the ultimate luxury. Each one had to be copied by hand, in ink, on parchment, taking months, even years. A single Bible could cost as much as a house. Only monks and nobles could touch knowledge, while commoners received it second-hand from priests' sermons. But when the first printed pages appeared, everything changed. Knowledge was no longer locked in church vaults, it began to multiply, to spread, and in a world shrouded in ignorance disguised as faith, that was nothing short of a revolution. For the first time, ordinary people could read the Bible in their own language, not just listen to what was preached. New ideas about freedom, humanity, science spread like wildfire. A monk in Germany, Martin Luther, took a hammer and nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and printed copies reached every corner of Europe in just months. The entire church trembled. The Middle Ages began to crack, not because of war, but because of words. But don't think everyone welcomed it. The ruling powers were terrified. To them, an uncontrolled book was more dangerous than an army. In many places, presses were burned, printers were killed, and authorities declared, "Knowledge is the devil's blade." Yet the more they banned it, the more people wanted it. Printers worked in secret at night, hiding engraved plates beneath tables and passing ink-stained sheets to each other as if they were holy relics. Villagers gathered in taverns to read every new line, debating, even fighting over a scrap of paper. And honest priests, those who still believed in God, but understood the power of knowledge, quietly protected the printers. The story of knowledge spread like a plague, but one that made people awake. For the first time, a farmer learned that the world wasn't flat, that the sun didn't revolve around the earth, that he had the right to ask, to think, to doubt. And it all began with simple pages printed in black ink. Then, along with knowledge, art began to transform. Painters no longer painted just to glorify the divine, but to celebrate humanity. Architects built churches that soared upward, filled with light and warmth, not only places of repentance, but of hope. Universities began to rise, and instead of memorizing commandments, students were encouraged to ask questions. The world was waking from a sleep that had lasted for centuries. But perhaps the strangest thing was this. It was the ordinary people, the uneducated, the powerless, who first felt the breath of this new age. A blacksmith read a passage about the balance of justice and began to wonder why he paid more taxes than his lord. A girl read the story of the heroine Jeanne d'Arc and believed that women too could wield swords. And the children, those who grew up in mud and hunger, saw drawings of stars and maps, and dreamed of the world beyond. Change didn't roar. It seeped in like rain soaking the earth. People stopped fearing the written word, they began to love it. Those printed pages, once strange and forbidden, became doors to the future. The Middle Ages, with all their darkness, suddenly cracked open to reveal a sliver of light. And in that light, someone realized if knowledge could be printed, then thought could fly. No miracles, no blood, just ink and paper, and the world began to change. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle in human history, that light didn't come from heaven, but from those trembling letters first pressed in ink, deep in a cold cellar, where an oil lamp flickered over hands that shook not from fear, but from hope. And so, the Middle Ages slowly came to an end, not with the clash of swords or the fall of kings, but with the tiny letters pressed onto rough paper. The age of fear, of ignorance praised as faith, of darkness mistaken for justice. All of it faded before the power of knowledge. People no longer knelt only to pray, they began to kneel to read. Hands that once held ploughs or swords now turned pages with the reverence of touching a miracle. And the churches, though still towering, no longer held the monopoly on truth. Light no longer shone only through stained glass windows, but from the books spreading across Europe. And there, amid the smell of ink and the rumble of printing presses, the Middle Ages died, but not in tragedy, in transformation. A new era began, where knowledge was no longer the privilege of the divine. Ideas of freedom, of human rights, of beauty, blossomed like spring flowers after a long winter. Humanity, after centuries in darkness, looked inward and realized they were not born to bow, but to understand, not to fear, but to create. In cities, schools sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Those once branded heretics were now celebrated as philosophers, artists, scientists. On walls, paintings no longer showed only saints, but real human faces with wrinkles, with smiles. For the first time, people dared to paint themselves, as if to declare, I exist. And you know what's most ironic? That very light, the beginning of the Renaissance, of scientific revolution, of the modern world, was born from the darkest places, the hands of the humble, of those who read in secret by candlelight. Not kings, not priests, but common people, dreamers, poor, afraid, yet hungry to know more than a sermon. They were the ones who saved the world from slumber. From mud and ash, knowledge rose, turning Europe into a land of ideas, of art, of experiments, and of questions. Questions no one had dared to ask for centuries. Why? How? If not God, then who? And the world trembled once more, but this time not from war, but from the awakening of the human mind. Everything once thought unshakable, power, religion, order, now faced those questions. And that was the true end of the Middle Ages, a period closed not with blood, but with ink. From then on, history was no longer written by the strong, but printed by the wise. And for storytellers like me, and listeners like you, perhaps we are the descendants of those who kept that flame alive. Because it was they, the ones who hid the printed pages in cellars, who copied words by candlelight, who passed down to the world its greatest gift, the freedom of thought. So when you open a book, or even just listen to this story, remember you are touching the final chapter of one era and the first page of everything that makes us human. The Middle Ages were not just darkness. They were the time when, amid fear and ignorance, humanity still dared to dream, dared to believe that light could be made by hand, not just by miracle. And thanks to those who dared to believe, the world stepped into a new dawn where knowledge, at last, belonged to everyone. In the middle of the Egyptian desert, where sand and wind blend like immortal souls, there is a legend whispered across thousands of years about the god with the wings of the sky, the one who shaped the order of the world. They call him Horus. Before humans could write, before the pyramids rose to touch the sun, his name was already carried by the wind. The guardian of light, the son of justice, the eyes of the heavens. The Egyptians believed that every time they looked up at the endless blue sky, where a falcon circled the burning sun, it was Horus watching over mankind. He was not a god born in glory, but in pain and blood. When the first kingdoms rose along the Nile, darkness came with them, chaos, betrayal, and the cruelty of Seth, the god of the desert. But within that darkness, a young spirit began to form, nourished by faith and vengeance. The old tales say that when the sun first rose upon the world, Horus opened his eyes. His first gaze made the birds take flight, and the Nile flow backward, for within his eyes burned the power of the universe, half light, half fire, the union of clarity and divine wrath. They said that when Horus flew, the sky trembled. When he spoke, the winds changed. Horus was the embodiment of authority, not power through fear, but the strength of justice itself. He was the roar of the storm, the promise that order still existed within chaos. In ancient temples, they carved the image of a falcon with its wings spread wide, the sun disk above its head shining like a crown. That was Horus, the child of the cosmos, and the living symbol of every pharaoh to come. Without him, there would be no kingship. Without kingship, no Egypt. Horus was born not merely to be a god, but to embody the sacred concept the Egyptians revered above all, Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. When Horus looked down, he saw mankind fighting, killing, and forgetting the light within themselves. So he spread his wings and covered them in shadow, reminding them that the light had always been above their heads, they had simply forgotten to look up. And when he looked up, he saw Ra, the sun god, smiling, for the sky had found its worthy heir. But in the legend, Horus was not only the god of light, he was a warrior, one who knew that peace never came without blood. From the moment he was born, destiny had placed him at the heart of an eternal battle, the war between order and chaos. The storytellers of old called him the storm of justice. When he appeared, the winds rose, sand filled the sky, and the wicked bowed their heads. Though divine, Horus carried a human heart he could love, hate, fear, yet never yield. The torches lit each night in his temples were reminders that the light of Horus never dies, even when darkness seems to devour the world. It was believed that when a pharaoh died, his soul became Horus to continue his sacred duty to protect kingship and uphold justice. And the living, every time they saw an eagle soaring over the desert, whispered the name Horus, as if calling to a god, or to their own faith that justice still exists, even as the world changes. In the wind that sweeps through ancient stone walls still echoes his first vow. As long as the sky is blue, order will endure. I am Horus, the eternal guardian of the light. And from that moment, the story of Horus began not just the tale of a god, but the journey of humanity's belief in its own strength, in a light that even time itself could never extinguish. Before Horus opened his eyes to the world, Egypt had once been a paradise, a land ruled by Osiris, the god of life, in justice and prosperity. Under his guidance the Nile flowed gently, the wheat bloomed, and people sang along the riverbanks. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Deep within the barren desert, another force was rising. Seth, the brother of Osiris, the god of storms, sand, and the red wilderness. Seth envied the light that his brother was worshipped for. He looked upon the green river winding through fertile lands, and his heart burned like a tempest. "Why does everyone bow to him?" Seth roared. "I am a god too. The same divine blood runs through my veins." From that moment, jealousy turned him into an eternal storm. One great festival was held to honor Osiris. Seth, pretending reconciliation, brought a golden coffin so exquisitely carved that all marveled at it. "Whoever fits perfectly into this coffin," he said, "shall receive it as my gift." One by one they tried it, but only when Osiris lay inside did the lid snap shut. Seth laughed, sealed it with iron, and hurled it into the Nile. The water exploded, and the god of life sank into the depths. All of Egypt fell silent. The sun did not rise for 3 days. The wind carried red sand, and the Nile turned the color of blood. Isis, wife of Osiris, searched endlessly for her husband's body. She wept, and every tear became a glowing pearl upon the sand. But Seth was not done. He found the body of Osiris, tore it into 14 pieces, and scattered them across Egypt so that no one could ever bring him back. From that moment, darkness spread everywhere. Without Osiris, mankind lost its way. The gods themselves turned against each other, and Seth declared himself king of the world. Under his rule, the sky lost its blue, the river stopped singing, and human souls began to fear the light itself. Egypt descended into chaos. Crops withered, people starved, and the strong preyed on the weak. The sands of the desert swallowed entire temples. They called it the Age of Silence, when even the gods turned away. In crumbling temples, old priests still prayed, "Osiris will return, the light will not die forever." But no one believed anymore. Seth laughed upon his throne, surrounded by storms, proclaiming that no god could ever challenge him again. He believed death was eternal, that nothing could surpass darkness. But somewhere, deep in the northern marshes, a spirit stirred quietly. Isis, the faithful wife, had never given up. She gathered every fragment of her husband's body, every shred of life, stitching them together with ancient magic. When her song rose, the wind stopped, the waters stilled, and the other gods bowed their heads. In that moment, Osiris, the slain king, lived again. Not to walk among the living, but to plant within Isis a seed, a small spark carrying both divine strength and human sorrow. Seth did not know that his cruelty had already forged his own destiny. From the blood and soul of Osiris, from the pain and magic of Isis, a new being was about to be born, a child with the wings of the sky, the eyes of justice, and a heart blazing like the sun Horus. And so, when Egypt believed everything was lost, another legend began. In the heart of the desert, where sand and darkness reigned, the fates of two bloodlines, light and chaos, were about to collide, to decide the future of the world. Under the pale reflection of the moon upon the still Nile, Isis knelt beside the lifeless body of Osiris. She placed her trembling hand upon the wound where his heart once beat, whispering ancient prayers known only to the goddesses of life. Her breath mingled with the darkness, and in that moment, the world stopped. The wind ceased, the waters stilled, and the entire universe seemed to listen to a love that dared to cross the boundary between life and death. Osiris, once the beloved king of all living things, was now only a hollow shell. But the love of Isis was stronger than fate itself. She gathered the torn pieces of his body, ripped apart by Seth, and pieced them back together, stitching them with linen threads and binding soul to flesh with the magic of Thoth. When her final incantation echoed through the night, a blue light burst forth. Osiris opened his eyes, but they were no longer the eyes of the living. "I have seen the darkness," he whispered, "and within it, I know I cannot return." Isis wept, but Osiris touched her cheek, smiling faintly like the fading moon. "Your love will not be in vain. From you and me a child shall be born, one who will bring light back to the world." As the two gods embraced in the shadows, the magic of life and death intertwined. The stars above flickered, as if bearing witness to the sacred moment. And from the soul of Osiris, mingled with the tears of Isis, a single spark fell to the earth, crystallizing into a life growing within the goddess's womb. That spark was Horus, the child of rebirth, of justice, and of hope. But the child was not born into peace. Seth still ruled, and he could feel the stir of divine power. "A successor is being born," he roared. "I will erase the bloodline of Osiris forever." He unleashed his desert demons to hunt down every trace of divine life. Knowing the danger, Isis fled the temples and hid in the northern marshes. Within her, she carried the seed of Horus her son, her last fragment of faith. Each night, she heard Seth's voice echo through the wind, the growl of a predator hunting its prey. She hid among the reeds, surviving on berries and dew, protecting the unborn child. Every time fear crept into her heart, she would lay her hand upon her belly and whisper, "Horus, my son, you are the light. You will soar above the darkness. You will restore justice to this world." In her dreams, Osiris still appeared, standing upon the glowing waters of the Nile. "Do not fear," he told her. "I am waiting for our son in the underworld. When his time comes, he will bridge the two realms." And so, amid the howling winds of the desert, among beasts and despair, both gods and mortals awaited a miracle. Then, one night, a child was born. When Horus opened his eyes, the first sunrise in years broke over the horizon. Light flooded the marshes, the sand shimmered like gold, and every living thing bowed its head. Horus did not cry like a human. He let out a clear, piercing call, like an eagle summoning the Sunday. It was the first sound of hope since Osiris fell. Isis held her son close, eyes filled with both joy and fear. She knew he had not been born to live quietly, but to fight. At that moment, Ra, the sun god, appeared in radiant glory. "This child," he proclaimed, "carries the blood of justice. When the time comes, he shall guard the order of the world in my place. His name shall be Horus, the one who sees all, protector of kingship and light." Then Ra vanished into the sky, leaving Isis with unshakable faith that her son was destined not only to inherit Osiris's legacy, but to save the world itself. And when Seth heard that the child had been born, his rage rose like a storm. He swore to hunt the boy to the ends of the earth, so that no one could ever challenge his throne. And thus, as the newborn light began to rise, darkness stirred once more. But this time, it would not consume the world so easily, for light now had a name, and that name was Horus. Isis knew her child could not grow up under the watchful eyes of the gods, and even less under Seth's shadow. She left behind the temples, the glory, and the divine halls, carrying the newborn Horus into the northern marshes of the Nile Delta, a land of mist and reeds so thick that even light lost its way. There, among water snakes and the hum of insects, a future god began to grow in silence. Days passed, nights passed, the winds blew cold, and sand from the desert crept in. Though a goddess, Isis lived as a mortal, catching fish, gathering fruit, and searching for clean water to feed her son. Many nights she held Horus close, and sang ancient lullaby songs handed down from the goddesses of motherhood before her to drive away fear. Each time Horus cried, the heavens seemed to tremble, as if Ra himself leaned down to listen, and because of that, darkness kept coming for them. Seth knew the child was still alive. He sent his desert demons, great serpents, scorpions, and lost souls to scour every corner of the land. Each night their shadows slithered across the river, hissing sounds so dreadful even the waters recoiled. But Isis had been taught by her sister, the goddess Nephthys, how to weave spells that could hide her from the world's very breath. She built a circle of reeds around their refuge, chanting the incantations of Thoth to confuse the demons. And so, for many years, Seth found nothing. Horus grew among the mud and mist, to the cries of herons and crocodiles. He learned to read the skies, to feel the wind, to know when storms would rise and when the Nile would flood. On certain days Isis let him run along the riverbanks, where he lifted his tiny hands toward the sun, feeling its heat flow through his palms. In that fire lived the strength of his father, the divine blood Osiris had left behind. But each time she looked at him, Isis felt both pride and fear. For the older he grew, the more he resembled his father, and that meant the easier it would be for Seth to recognize him should they ever meet. Once, when Horus was still small, Isis left briefly to find food. When she returned, she found her son lying motionless, his face pale. A serpent from the desert had slithered in and bitten him as he slept. Isis fell to her knees, cradling him in her arms, tears dripping onto his cold lips. "No," she whispered. "My child is light, darkness cannot consume him." She recited the oldest of spells, calling out to Ra, Thoth, Anubis, and even Osiris himself. Finally, She pressed her lips to the wound, drawing the venom out, praying that her life might be exchanged for his. A streak of lightning split the sky. The Nile surged, and thunder rolled from the south. Horus opened his eyes. From that day on, his gaze held two colors, one the blue of the heavens, the other the gold of the desert. They were eyes that could see both light and shadow. The tale was told for thousands of years as proof that a mother's love could defy even the gods. Isis was not just the goddess of magic, she was the embodiment of unyielding love. She taught Horus that true strength came not from hatred, but from the will to protect. "You were not born to take revenge," she said. "You were born to bring balance. Once you understand that, the world will bow before you." And Horus listened, growing up with the wings of a falcon and the heart of a devoted son. When the desert wind stirred, he spread those wings for the first time, radiant feathers blazing in the Sunday. The sky shuddered, and all living things felt a shift in the air. For the first time since Osiris had fallen, a god of light had taken flight. Far away, in his castle of sand, Seth opened his eyes. He looked up and saw the shadow of a falcon circling the sun, and he knew. The destiny he had once tried to destroy had returned. From that moment, the war between two bloodlines, light and darkness, began in silence, waiting for the day it would erupt. Horus grew up among the marshes, where the ground was as soft as memory, where sky and water merged without boundaries. From the moment he opened his eyes, he saw that the world was never at peace. Each sunrise still came wrapped in mist, and the whispering reeds carried warnings in the wind. Isis taught her son to read the language of nature, to know when storms would come, when predators were near. She said, "Every breath of the earth has a spirit. If you listen, you'll know when to fight and when to hide." Horus listened, but inside him burned a flame that even Isis could not extinguish. It was anger, the inheritance Seth had unknowingly sown in Osiris's bloodline. He did not remember his father's face, yet whenever he closed his eyes, he saw a man bound in chains, his eyes filled with pain and an unbroken pride. "Father," Horus whispered, "I will reclaim the kingdom for you." But when Isis heard those words, she stayed silent. She knew that day would come, but also that if Horus followed rage, he would become no different from the enemy he sought to defeat. One morning, as pale sunlight pierced the mist, Horus found an old wounded kite fallen by the riverbank. Its wings were torn. He cared for it, named it Beck. The bird became his companion, circling above him as he trained. Horus learned to move with the wind, to strike by instinct, and to use speed instead of force. He didn't yet know that these moments were shaping him into the very symbol of the sky, the being who would one day be revered as the eyes of the Sunday. As he grew older, Horus began to hear tales of Seth from the marsh dwellers, those who had been enslaved by him, who had lost their homes, their children, to his beasts. Each story left a scar on Horus's heart. He no longer slept peacefully. Many nights he dreamt of Seth sitting on a throne surrounded by skulls, laughing amid a storm of sand. Each time he woke, Horus stood by the river, watching his reflection ripple, and whispered, "One day I will face him." Isis knew and did not stop him. She only said, "When you seek justice, don't let the darkness within your heart win." Then she gave him an amulet, shaped like an eye, carved from gold and turquoise. "This is the symbol of sight," she said. "It will help you see even in darkness. But remember sometimes, what you most need to see isn't before your eyes." Horus held the charm, feeling the warmth of his mother's hand still lingering on his skin. He understood it was more than a gift, it was a warning. Then one afternoon, as the sun bled red across the sky, a messenger appeared, a divine bird carrying a message from the realm of the gods. "The time has come," it spoke in the voice of the wind. "Seth knows the heir of Osiris lives. He is gathering his armies." Horus clenched his fist. He needed no further words. He knew his childhood in the marshes was over. He looked toward his mother, eyes filled with both resolve and fear. "I have to go," he said. Isis placed her hand on his shoulder and nodded gently. "I have known this day would come. But before you leave, remember, fight to protect, not to avenge." Horus knelt, pressing his forehead to her hand, a final gesture of farewell. He did not know it would be the last time they shared the same sky. When Horus took flight on Beck's back, the winds howled, the waters rose, and the sky itself changed colour. From afar, in his desert palace, Seth lifted his head. His eyes burned red as embers. "He has come," Seth growled. "The son of the one I killed." The first storm of destiny began to form over Egypt, and once again the world prepared to witness the clash between light and darkness. When Horus left the marshes, the world unfolded before his eyes, but it was also the first time he truly understood the loneliness of one bound by destiny. The desert wind blew past him, carrying the dry heat and the scent of burning sand, nothing like the gentle humidity of his mother's home. Horus looked up. The blazing sun seemed to watch him, the child of light. He flew with Beck over lands conquered by Seth, barren fields, ruined villages, statues of Osiris shattered into headless stone stumps, silent witnesses to atrocity. Everywhere he passed, the people looked up, unsure if he was an omen of salvation or doom. An old woman knelt by the riverbank, praying when she saw his shadow sweep across the sky. "If you are the divine bird of Osiris, please bring justice back to us." Horus descended, said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, then took flight again. But her plea echoed endlessly in his heart. That night, he rested in a ruined temple. Moonlight streamed through the broken pillars, illuminating an ancient carving of Osiris. Horus knelt before his father's image, Beck's wings folding gently behind him like a sacred veil. "Father," he whispered, "I've seen what they suffer. I'm not afraid anymore." When Horus closed his eyes, the wind went still. A deep voice echoed inside his mind, the sound of memory and spirit. "My son, justice is not revenge. If you let hatred guide you, you will become the very darkness you wish to destroy." Horus opened his eyes. No one was there, only the moon and the wind, but his father's words were carved into his soul. The next morning, Horus continued his journey. He sought out warriors still loyal to the old reign, those who had once served Osiris. They lived in hiding, scattered, waiting for a sign. When they saw the golden eye emblem on Horus's chest, they knelt without a word. An old general named Neferu stepped forward. "We thought the bloodline of Osiris was gone." Horus nodded. It never was. It was only waiting to awaken. They began to gather, forging weapons from scraps of iron, training one another to fight in the arid sands. Horus led not with words, but with power. Whenever he spread his wings, the wind roared, the sand rose, and the soldiers felt as if the sun itself was flying beside them. Word of Horus spread quickly. When Seth heard, he shattered his throne in fury. "The son of Osiris dares to challenge me. I'll crush him like dust." He sent messengers, hyenas with human faces, to deliver his challenge. "If you are truly the son of Osiris, come face the god of the desert." Horus did not back down. He stepped into the storm, his eyes burning gold. "Tell him," Horus said, "the sun will rise even when he tries to drown it in shadow." That night, he stood alone upon the dunes, gazing at the blood-red horizon. Beck circled above, crying anxiously. Horus reached up, gently stroking the bird's wings. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Tomorrow, the sky will be ours." Yet inside him, fear lingered, not of Seth, but of his own rage. He remembered his mother's words, and the look in Osiris's eyes from his dreams. He knew this battle was not only between two gods, but between light and darkness within himself. When dawn came, the sun blazed atop distant pyramids. Horus donned his golden armor, took his spear engraved with the symbol of the eye. The wind howled so fiercely the sand became a storm. Beck soared high above, and from the horizon came the sound of drums, Seth's army, vast as night itself. Horus did not retreat. He raised his head and said softly, "Today, I fight not only for my father, but for those who have forgotten what light means." When Horus took flight, the desert ignited. Sand spiraled into whirlwinds, thunder cracked across a cloudless sky. It was the first battle between Horus, the young god of the heavens, and Seth, the lord of chaos. And they say, from that day on, whenever the wind sweeps across the desert, if you listen closely, you can still hear the beating wings of Beck, circling above, a reminder to the world that light has never bowed to darkness. As the sun rose above the horizon, the Egyptian desert blazed like a vast sea of fire. Horus stood atop a dune, his golden armor reflecting the dawn. Beck's wings spread wide behind him like twin streaks of light slicing through the wind. Before him, Seth's army surged forward, a chaotic horde, drums pounding against the earth like the heartbeat of demons. Seth emerged among them, tall and broad, his skin red like molten bronze, his eyes burning like embers. He grinned wickedly, his voice booming like thunder. "Son of Osiris, you finally show yourself. What now? Have you come to avenge him?" Horus said nothing. He raised his spear, the light at its tip cutting across Seth's face. "No," Horus answered firmly. "I've come to end the chaos you've spread." Seth laughed, a cruel, echoing sound like the wind scraping through sand. "End chaos? You think you understand this world, child of light? Don't you know that order exists only through fear?" Horus gripped his spear tighter, the sand swirling around him as if lifted by invisible hands. "You're wrong. Order is born from faith, not fear." That sentence was a spark thrown into oil. Seth roared, swinging his long trident of black steel, and the desert quaked. The two gods clashed, light and shadow colliding in a storm that tore the heavens apart. Beck soared high above, its cry echoing like thunder. From the sky, they looked like two shapes locked in eternal motion, a blazing golden falcon and a massive black serpent battling between earth and air. Seth was strong. Each strike of his shattered the ground, whipping up blinding whirlwinds of sand. But Horus was faster. Every time he darted aside, he left a streak of light trailing behind him like a falling star. The battle raged from dawn until the sun sank in the west. Divine blood spilled and seeped into the earth, turning the desert red beneath the sunset. As darkness crept in, Seth roared, "You cannot kill me, Horus. I am the desert, the storm, the night that never dies." Horus stepped back, breathing hard, his eyes glowing like twin stars. "And I," he replied, "am the sky, the one that holds you." Then he hurled his spear into the heavens, and light exploded. From its tip burst a white beam, painting Ra's eye across the sky, the symbol of life and justice. The light struck down, piercing through Seth's body. The god screamed as his form disintegrated into dust, leaving only the sound of howling wind and the scent of burnt metal. But Horus did not smile. He knelt, pressing his hand into the crimson sand, exhaustion filling every breath. "Victory," he whispered, "is never joy." Beck landed beside him, its dark eyes glimmering, as if to remind him, the war isn't over. And truly, when night fell, the wind rose again, carrying faint laughter, Seth's laughter, drifting like a ghost. Horus knew, the god of chaos could not be destroyed, only contained. He looked toward the distant Nile, where moonlight shimmered on the water like a silver path to the world of the dead. "Father," he said into the wind, "I have driven him back, but peace has not yet returned. I must find a way to end this." Then Horus turned north, toward the ancient temple Isis once spoke of, the place where the old gods guarded the secret of balance between order and chaos. Above him, Beck flew, crying out into the night, its echo stretching across the heavens. Under the moonlight, Horus spread his wings wide, as if embracing all of Egypt. They say that night, the sky shone brighter than any before. And in that light, for the first time, the people of Egypt lifted their eyes, feeling that a true God was watching over them, not to rule, but to protect. Horus was no longer Isis's child. He had become a symbol not just of the sky, but of the belief that even when darkness reigns, the light will always return with every sunrise. After the first battle, Horus did not return to the marshlands. He ventured deeper into the desert, a realm of wind, stone, and the memories of forgotten gods. Every step was a trial, for the ground beneath his feet was not mere sand, but the remains of souls Seth had buried long ago. He could hear them whispering in the wind, calling the name of Osiris, calling for the light that was lost. But Horus did not stop. He knew victory was only the beginning. To end the chaos, he had to restore balance, something even the ancient gods had never achieved. The first gust of wind carried an eerie chill. The sand swirled into faces, laughing mockingly, taunting him. "Child of light, are you sure there is no darkness in your heart?" Horus gripped his spear tighter, his eyes glowing like shards of the Sunday. "Every darkness has its limits," he said. "But light only needs one spark to endure." The wind vanished. Before him rose an ancient temple, its walls etched with symbols almost devoured by time. Within that temple, Isis had told him, stood a statue that held the spirit of Ra, the father of all gods, the one who had granted power to the bloodline of Osiris. Horus stepped inside, and the world outside fell silent. In the thick darkness, the only light came from his spear, reflecting off hundreds of carved eyes upon the walls, eyes that watched, judged, and tested his truth. A voice echoed, deep as breaking stone. "Who enters the temple of Ra? Do you seek power, or do you seek to prove you are worthy of it?" Horus knelt, his voice steady yet resolute. "I come not for power, but for peace. If I must fight again, I wish to do it for the world, not for vengeance." The air swirled, and the sand rose, shaping itself into a massive falcon with burning eyes. "You speak like a god," the voice thundered. "But have you truly forsaken your hatred?" Horus closed his eyes. He remembered his father, his mother, the bodies Seth had left behind, and the fury that had burned in him for years. "I have not forgotten," he whispered, "but I have learned not to let it lead me." In that moment, light flooded the temple. The statue of Ra ignited in solar fire, illuminating Horus's face. Ra's voice resonated from the very core of the earth. "You understand what many gods never will. Justice does not lie in the blade, but in the hand that wields it." The light merged into his spear. Above Horus, a blazing sun disk appeared, circling his head. Beck flew around him, its wings glowing gold. Horus rose, a new strength flowing through his veins, not the kind that burns, but the kind that guides. He stepped out of the temple and looked up to see the vastest sky he had ever known. For the first time, Horus felt truly at home. The sky was his blood, his field of eternity, the very realm his father had once protected. But peace lasted only a single breath. As Horus lifted his gaze to the sun, a black wind tore through the air, cold as steel. The shadow of Seth appeared again, no longer in human form, but as a massive storm devouring the heavens. His voice rumbled from afar. "Did you think you'd won, Horus? I am chaos. You can only silence me for a while." Horus raised his spear, his voice echoing across the firmament. "No one can silence chaos, but I can make it kneel before order." The sand erupted like waves. The earth quaked beneath their power. From afar, the other gods watched as two forces, one golden, one black, spiraled together in the sky, like the sun and moon locked in struggle. Isis, standing on the banks of the Nile, looked up, tears glistening silently. She knew this was not just Horus's battle. It was the test of the entire world. Horus soared higher, Beck crying out above him. Amid a sky ablaze, he dove into Seth, and once again light exploded, but this time it was not fire alone. It was the union of light and shadow. For only when the sky holds both can the world truly exist. And that was the moment Horus understood. His purpose was not to destroy Seth, but to contain him as day and night forever chase each other, neither ever truly gone. When the storm subsided, the sky returned to a pale blue, like the calm after a long cry. Horus descended, his feet touching the sand still warm with light. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the emptiness that always followed battle. The power of Ra now rested in his hands, but Horus knew that victory did not bring peace. Everything around him was eerily silent. Only the wind whispered through the cracks of stone, carrying the scent of blood, smoke, and sand. Beck, his faithful companion, circled once before landing on his shoulder, tilting its head and letting out a soft cry. Horus smiled faintly, gently stroking its feathers. "It's all right, Beck," he whispered. "We made it through, but the war isn't over." Far off, the sunset began to stain the horizon red. Horus looked up, watching the sun sink into the dunes, and there he felt it. A strange stirring in the air, like something watching from the shadows. He closed his eyes and let his instincts guide him. From within the wind, a voice called out, not Seth's, not the god's, but his own, echoing from deep within his soul. "You've reclaimed the light, Horus, but do you know how to keep it? He opened his eyes. Before him stretched an ancient stone path, leading to an unfinished pyramid, a place said to hold the heart of balance. Isis had once told him that this heart was where Ra had placed a fragment of his own soul, to ensure that light and darkness could never destroy one another. If one grew stronger than the other, the world itself would collapse. Horus knew Seth would never give up, and if Seth reached the heart first, everything would end. He pressed on, passing broken statues of gods and carvings that spoke of dynasties swallowed by sand. Each step burned, blood mixing with grit, but he did not stop. When he reached the pyramid, he found great bronze doors sealed tight, bound by the magic of the old gods. Horus placed his hand upon them, feeling the current of power surge through. Inside, something pulsed, slow, steady like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He took a deep breath, channeling all the energy within. Light poured from his eyes, merging with the spear, and shot straight into the doors. A deep rumble echoed. The pyramid trembled, and the doors opened as streams of radiant mist poured out like the souls of stars freed after millennia. Inside, there was no gold or glory, only a vast, silent chamber. At its center floated a glowing orb, swirling with countless tiny stars. Horus stepped forward and knelt. "The heart of balance," he whispered. The light from the orb illuminated his face, reflecting two halves in his eyes, one golden as the sun, the other dark as night. He understood then. No one is purely light or purely shadow. They are both part of the same whole. But just as he reached toward the heart, the ground quaked. A black fissure split across the floor, and from it, Seth emerged no longer in human form, but as a massive serpent made of smoke. He laughed, his voice booming like thunder. "You think I'd let you take it, Horus? Balance is something I can break, for I am chaos itself." Horus stepped back, the light on his spear flaring, reflecting off the orb. "No, Seth," he declared. "You can't destroy balance because even you need it to exist." Seth roared, slashing forward. Horus dodged, Beck darting around to distract the beast. Once again, light and shadow clashed, white brilliance and black storm entwining, filling the temple with blinding radiance. But this time, Horus did not fight with anger. He fought with understanding. Instead of striking Seth, he focused his power into the heart of balance, making it blaze brighter, so bright even Seth faltered. "You can't defeat me with hatred," Horus said, "but I can bind you with the very light you helped create." Then he drove his spear into the ground. Light surged outward, merging with the heart. A vortex of wind rose, pulling Seth inward, his screams echoing like a sandstorm. "Horus, you'll never destroy me! I will live in every rage of mankind!" Horus closed his eyes, tears falling softly, and whispered, "And I will live in their courage." With those words, everything went still. The sand drifted down slowly, the light dimmed. Horus collapsed, drained of strength. Before him, the heart of balance glowed softly, steady once more. Beck landed beside him, nuzzling his hand. Horus smiled faintly. "It's done," he murmured. "At least, for today." Above the pyramid, the sky cleared, and the sun rose shining across all of Egypt. From that day on, people said that whenever the sun rose after a sandstorm, it was the moment Horus opened his eyes once more to guard the world for another day. After the battle within the pyramid, Horus returned to the world of men, but Egypt was no longer the same. Sand had swallowed the old rivers. The temples stood silent as if the gods had abandoned them, and people gazed at the sky with anxious eyes. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed they had seen Seth in their dreams, whispering into their minds, sowing fear and doubt among one another. Horus understood, though Seth had been trapped within the heart of balance, his will of chaos still slithered into human hearts, like darkness hidden inside light. He walked through deserted villages, seeing fallen statues of gods and empty altars. "Humans have forgotten us," Beck said, his voice raspy like dry wind. Horus shook his head. "No, they haven't forgotten. They're just too afraid to believe." He passed starving children, old men lighting candles in prayer, and soldiers who still kept their oaths, swearing to protect the light even when they could no longer see it. When the sun rose high, Horus stopped in the middle of the desert, closed his eyes, and felt the energy flowing through the land. Life was still there, but faint, flickering like a candle about to die. He knew that to truly restore order, he had to remind humankind of what they once were. Beings born from the breath of the gods, carrying both light and shadow within them, yet free to choose their own path. That night, Horus rose into the sky, with Bex soaring beside him. Looking down upon Egypt, he saw thousands of lonely torches scattered across the darkness. "If they no longer believe in the gods," he said, "then the gods will believe in them." Then he spread his wings wide and called out a new vow. "From this moment, I am not only the god of the sky, but the eyes of humankind. Whenever they look up, I will be there." From that moment on, Horus no longer stayed in divine palaces. He walked among mortals, living as a wandering warrior. He helped villagers fend off beasts, stopped desert raiders, and taught them to use knowledge instead of fear. People began calling him by many names: the Winged One, Son of the Sun, the One who sees all. In every place he visited, Horus carved his golden eye, the Eye of Horus, as a mark of protection. Not only to ward off evil, but to remind them that justice needed no weapon, only the light of truth. Yet in long, restless nights, when the wind hissed across the dunes, Horus still heard Seth's voice, faint, distant, like a ghost's echo. "How long can you keep them believing, Horus? When they begin to doubt, your light will fade too." Horus did not answer. He simply looked to the heavens, where a faint streak of light, the scar from their battle, crossed the stars. It was both a wound and a promise. Once, Horus stopped by a riverside village where the people argued over which god to worship. Some said Ra, some said Seth to avoid misfortune, others wanted to forget them all. Horus stepped among them, never revealing his name, and said, "Do you see the sun rise each day? That is the sign of Ra. Do you see the night fall? That is the sign of Seth. Both exist, but what makes the sun rise inside you? That is what deserves your worship." The villagers fell silent. They didn't fully understand, but something in the traveller's voice warmed their hearts. When Horus left, a child ran after him and asked, "Who are you?" He smiled and answered, "The one who keeps the sky so you can dream." From then on, the story was told and retold through generations, until the Eye of Horus became more than a divine emblem. It became a human one, a symbol of faith that no matter how broken the world becomes, as long as someone dares to look up, the light will endure. And with every dawn that followed, as the first rays of sunlight crossed the pyramids, people said Horus opened his eyes once more, watching over humankind not from a throne, but from the very sky he once swore to protect. As time passed, Horus was no longer the young god with golden wings, but the symbol of endurance of those who dared to rise amid despair. Yet the deeper he walked among humankind, the more he understood one thing. People did not only need to be guided by light, they needed to be reminded that the light was already within them. One night, Horus stopped at the city of Thebes, once the heart of ancient Egypt. Now, it was only ruins, broken pillars, walls swallowed by sand, and in the air lingered the damp scent of the past. Horus stepped into the temple of Osiris, where his father had once been worshipped. Among the wreckage stood half a statue, its face worn away, but the stone eyes still gazed toward the sky. He knelt, placed his hand on the cold slab, and whispered, "Father, I've done all I could, but I can't keep the light in their hearts forever. They forget too easily." The wind blew through the shattered halls, echoing like a distant reply. Horus rose, the moonlight glinting off his scarred golden armor. "Then what must I do to make them remember, Father?" The answer came not from Osiris, but from his own memory, the words Isis once spoke. "Light cannot be kept, Horus. It can only be passed on." And Horus understood. He left the temple and soared high, his wings cutting across the moon, scattering silver light over the quiet flow of the Nile. The next morning, he appeared in a small village where people still worshipped Seth out of fear. Horus did not reveal his divine form. He became a mortal craftsman, carrying with him a stone carving of a golden eye. When the villagers asked, he said simply, "This is the symbol of sight, not of a god, but of yourselves." He taught them to carve that symbol on their walls, their gates, their doors, and told them, "When you look upon it, remember that a part of the sky lives within your eyes." The villagers obeyed, not because they believed in miracles, but because his words gave them peace. Then one night, fire engulfed the village. A band of desert raiders attacked, demanding gold and grain. Horus stood in the square, his eyes burning like blades of fire. "Are you afraid?" he asked the villagers. "If you are, then bow your heads, but remember, when you bow, you will no longer see the sky." Those words spread like wildfire. The villagers no longer hid. They stood together and fought. Horus led them with his spear, and for the first time in years, the light came not from the flames, but from the eyes of people who had forgotten how to fear. When the raiders were defeated, Horus claimed no glory. He simply placed the golden eye in the center of the village and said softly, "Justice isn't waiting for gods to grant it. It's when people protect one another." From then on, rumors spread across the land of a wanderer of light who traveled through Egypt, teaching people to see themselves. Some said it was the god Horus. Others claimed it was a madman who believed the light lived in every heart. But that no longer mattered, because every time a village was saved, people carved the image of the golden eye on their walls, and in the darkness, when the wind passed by, they swore they could hear the wings of a falcon gliding across the sky. Over time, the Eye of Horus became not just a symbol of faith, but of memory, a memory of when the gods did not rule above, but walked among humankind. And in the quiet nights, when the moonlight shimmered over the river, people told their children the story of a god who chose to live as a man to teach mankind how to be divine. From above, Horus listened to those tales and smiled, for he knew, in the end, light needed no temple, no throne. It only needed one place to live, in the hearts of those brave enough to lift their eyes to the sky. After many years wandering across Egypt, Horus realized that the world had changed. The people who once trembled in fear had begun to stand on their own, and the small villages of old now carved the symbol of the Eye of Horus upon their gates, a vow that light would never fade again. But along with that faith, Horus also came to understand something deeper. Light, when it exists too long without darkness, makes people forget why they once needed it. He began to see that justice was not merely about punishing evil, but about perceiving the line between right and wrong within the human soul. One day, Horus stopped in Memphis, once the grandest capital of his father's reign. The city still stood tall, but the hearts of its people had changed. Here, new priests preached that justice could be bought with gold, that repentance could be purchased with offerings to the gods. When Horus heard this, he did not grow angry. He simply walked into the temple where people prayed before a false idol, a golden-eyed figure made in his likeness. The crowd bowed and threw coins at its feet. Horus watched in silence for a long time, then smiled faintly. "They worship the light," he said, "but they've forgotten that the light was born from darkness." As his words echoed, the statue cracked, its gold veneer crumbling away to reveal rough black stone beneath. The crowd panicked, but Horus did not blame them. "Justice," he said, "does not rest in the hands of the powerful. It lives in the eyes of those who choose to see." Then he left, leaving behind an empty temple, yet in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, something had awakened. Rumors spread across the land of a god who refused to be worshipped, and even the gods of the heavens began to whisper. The divine council gathered. "Horus has abandoned his throne, lowering himself to walk among mortals. Is that wisdom or rebellion?" Ra, the one who had once bestowed his power upon Horus, simply said, "A god who understands humanity is 1,000 times stronger than one who merely rules over them." But not all agreed. Some of the old gods believed Horus was weakening the authority of the divine, that if mortals learned to protect themselves, they would no longer need gods at all. And so, a council was convened to judge Horus. The summons reached him as he stood atop a western mountain, the sunset burning red like blood. He knew this would not be just a trial of gods, it was the final test. Could justice exist even among those who claimed perfection? Atop the Great Pyramid, Horus stepped into a circle of gods. Ra sat at the center, his gaze both sorrowful and proud. Beside him stood Anubis, god of judgment, silently holding the scales. Seth was there too, no longer a beast, but a shadow lurking in the smoke. "Horus," said Ra, "you've been called here for changing the meaning of order. You no longer act as a god." Horus knelt, his voice calm. "I have not broken order, Father. I have only made it true." Ra looked deep into his eyes, where light and shadow met. Then prove it. Horus approached Anubis. The scales were set on one side, his heart, on the other, the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth. The scales trembled, then stilled, perfectly balanced. The council fell silent. Ra smiled faintly. True justice is neither heavy nor light. It is balance. Seth roared from within the smoke. He's still a threat to you all. When humans believe in themselves, you'll have nothing left. Horus turned to him, no anger in his eyes, only understanding. You're wrong, Seth. When humans believe in themselves, they finally become the image of the gods. Seth fell silent. His shadow faded into nothingness. Ra rose, his light flooding the sky. From this day forth, Horus shall be not only the god of the sky, but the god of justice, the one who sees the soul in every heart. And so, whenever people sought justice, they no longer prayed, they simply looked up, for they knew Horus was not on a throne, nor hidden in a temple, but everywhere in the eyes of those who dared to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. On the vast red desert, where nothing existed but wind and sand, Horus stood facing Seth for the last time. That day, the sky no longer held the sun. Ra had stopped midway across the heavens, allowing both light and darkness to witness this fateful battle. Two gods, two symbols, two halves of the world about to end a feud that had lasted for centuries. No more curses, no more laws, only strength and will. The wind struck so fiercely that the earth itself trembled, sandstorms rising like the uprising of 1,000 souls. Seth roared, his body growing immense, half beast, half man, his eyes burning red like fire. You think you understand justice, Horus? Justice is power. It's the one who survives. Horus said nothing. His falcon wings glimmered beneath the flashes of lightning, and the eye of Horus blazed within the storm, illuminating every corner of his enemy's soul. No, Seth, his voice rang out, calm as the Nile in flood season. Justice isn't survival. It's the choice to stop even when you have the power to kill. Seth screamed, exhaling a gust of venomous wind from the heart of the desert. Horus shot into the sky, the Pegasus of Egypt, the sacred falcon radiating a blue light that cut through the storm. They clashed mid-air, the sound of impact shaking the world. Mountains split, rivers rose, pyramids trembled. The people of Egypt fell to their knees, watching the heavens tear in two, light and shadow twisting together. A bolt of lightning split the ground, hurling Seth down, flames from his mouth burning the sand into black glass. Horus descended, chest bloodied, but his eyes still burned like fire. He raised the sword of the sun and walked forward. Seth laughed hoarsely. Kill me, and you'll become me, Horus. What light exists without darkness to define it? Horus stopped. The wind and sand swirled around them, as if the entire world were holding its breath. He lowered his sword, his voice deep as distant thunder. No, Seth, I don't need darkness to shine, but I need you to remember that even light can fade. Then he raised his hand. The light from Horus's palm shone forth not to destroy Seth, but to transform him into a trail of black smoke that drifted toward the horizon, where only wasteland and wind remained. You will exist, Horus said, but never return. The world still needs chaos to understand order, but it doesn't need you to spread hatred. The storm subsided. The sun rose again. Horus stood upon the dunes, gazing east, where the first light swept across the earth. The gods above watched in silence. Ra slowly stood, his light cascading down upon Horus. You have won not by blood, but by mercy. That is true victory. The rays spread outward, reaching the farthest temples, dissolving the dust that had long clouded them. The people of Egypt looked up all at once, seeing a falcon flying across the sun, its wings embracing the world. They said that day, the Nile changed colour, no longer red like blood, but blue as dawn. Horus spoke no more. He simply closed the eye of the god, and in that moment, the universe seemed to hear the heartbeat of a single truth, that war does not end with triumph, but with forgiveness. From then on, the Red Desert was no longer a place of death, but a land with a new name, the place where light rose. There, a great stone pillar was built, carved with the image of a falcon spreading its wings, and at its base were the words, the day when justice no longer needed a sword. The storytellers who came after called it the Battle of the Sky, but Horus never called it war. To him, it was the moment light finally understood why darkness existed, to remind mankind that even when night falls, dawn will still come, as long as they keep their faith. Before the desert sands had even settled, Horus knelt before the council of gods, his body still marked with the blood and ashes of the final battle. The sun blazed high above, and within that light, Ra, the sun god, father of order, slowly rose. His eyes burned like fire, his voice thundered across the heavens. Horus, son of Osiris, bearer of the wings of justice, you have fought not only to avenge your father, but to preserve Ma'at, the sacred balance of the world. You did not kill Seth. You understood that light cannot exist without darkness. Therefore, the council decrees, you are the rightful king of Egypt, the protector of order and of mankind. When Ra's words ended, the sky trembled, all the heavens bowed. From Horus's wings, a surge of blue light burst forth, spreading across the desert, the Nile, and the ancient pyramids. The wind carried with it the cheers of thousands of souls. They called Horus's name as though calling the dawn of a new era. The other gods, Thoth, Anubis, Bastet, rose and raised their hands in praise. Above, the sun tilted, its light falling upon Horus's eyes, turning them into an eternal symbol of wisdom and protection. But amid the celebration, a rough voice echoed again. It was Ra once more. As for Seth, he cannot exist where light touches, yet he cannot be destroyed. Therefore, I banish him to the wastelands where there is no water, no man, only wind and solitude. There, he shall wander forever, a reminder that chaos never disappears, it merely sleeps within the hearts of the weak. Hearing this, Horus bowed his head. He felt no joy, no pride. He knew today's victory was not an ending, but the beginning of a long mission to keep the scales of justice balanced between light and shadow. At that moment, Isis stepped forward from among the gods. The goddess of magic and motherhood approached, touching her son's forehead. "My child," she whispered, "your father Osiris must be proud, but remember, a crown is a flame. It warms those who need it, but it can burn the one who wears it." Horus nodded, and for the first time in many years, he smiled a small smile, but brighter than the Egyptian sunrise. Ra came closer, holding the sun scepter in his hand. "Horus, from this day forth, you shall be known as the keeper of order. You will not only rule over men but guard their souls. Every pharaoh from this day on shall be your embodiment, the one who inherits the falcon's wings to keep peace between the mortal world and the realm of gods." Horus reached out and accepted the scepter. As its golden tip touched his palm, thousands of images flashed before him. The Nile flowing strong, golden fields gleaming, children's laughter, and drifting souls across white sands. Every life, no matter how small, was a part of Ma'at he was bound to protect. In that moment, the light around Horus was no longer just for battle. It became a source of life spreading outward. Beneath the earth, the people of Egypt witnessed a miracle. Falcons flying in circles around the sun, and a golden beam rising from the tip of a pyramid, piercing the heavens. They called that day the Day of the Falcon King. In temples, priests knelt and carved into the walls. The child of Isis and Osiris has restored justice. Horus has triumphed. But none knew that as the world rejoiced, Horus quietly looked to the sky, where light met the wind. He knew Seth was still there in the desert, in the storms, within the hearts of men. And this world, no matter how peaceful, would always need the eyes of the falcon to watch over it. At the end of the ceremony, Ra raised his hand, his voice echoing across the heavens. "From this day, the order of Ma'at is restored. Seth is exiled, Horus ascends. The world returns to the cycle of light." The sun began to move once more, shining down on the Nile, glimmering like a ribbon of silver. The land blazed with light, and within it, Horus, god of the sky and war, spread his wings and soared upward, leaving behind a streak of brilliance across the horizon, the boundary between darkness and dawn. That was the moment history closed, not with blood, but with justice, wisdom, and compassion. From then on, Egypt entered a new age, where every sunrise was seen as the step of Horus flying across the sky. From the day Horus was named the protector of Ma'at, Egypt entered an era of light and order. The sun shone down upon the Nile, not only as a source of life but as the mark of the divine. Across the land, people built statues of falcons, carved the eye of Horus upon temple walls, upon the foreheads of pharaoh statues, and even upon the coffins of the departed. For from that moment on, Horus was not only the god of war but also the very soul of kingship. Every pharaoh, upon ascending the throne, swore beneath the statue of the god, "I am the son of Horus, he who will rule with justice and guard the order of Ma'at." They believed that within their very veins flowed the light of Horus, the strength of integrity and compassion. Dynasties rose one after another, and every king bore the falcon as the emblem of power. When the pharaoh raised his scepter, people said it was the moment Horus spread his wings in the heavens, shielding Egypt from chaos and the fires of war. Under the reign of Horus, laws were written, not harsh decrees born of fear of the gods, but principles founded on balance. The weak were protected, the wrong were given a chance to atone, and those who betrayed Ma'at were judged beneath the gaze of Horus, the symbol of truth that could not be hidden. The temple guards called it the eye that never closes, for they believed that even when night fell, the eye of Horus remained open, watching over every soul that wandered the desert. The new dynasty shone brighter than any before it. Trees grew lush, fields ripened with gold, and trading ships bearing gold, copper, and jewels glided along the Nile like serpents of light. The sages of the temples recorded the teachings of Horus, turning them into sacred scriptures for future generations. To rule is not to be worshipped, but to protect. Light endures only when the heart is free of shadow. The people memorized those words, carving them upon their homes, their pottery, and the amulets hung around their children's necks. But glory was not found only in power. Horus brought to Egypt something it had never known: the belief that humanity could share in divinity. He walked down from his temples, spoke with farmers, stonemasons, and warriors alike. The elders would tell, "I saw him standing in the marketplace, asking the merchant, 'Is there enough food for all?' He said, 'Justice is not found upon the throne, but upon the scales in every heart.'" Thus, every Egyptian, from slave to noble, believed that by doing right they were helping Horus uphold Ma'at, and that faith, not fear, made the kingdom strong. During every festival, people sang praises to Horus, no longer calling him the god of war, but the keeper of the sky. Children tossed sand into the air, calling it the wings of Horus flying by. When the wind rose, they believed it was his greeting from above. In paintings, Horus no longer held a sword, but a scale of light, standing between the sun and the moon, the symbol of eternal harmony. In distant lands, priests told stories of the god who forgave his enemy instead of destroying him. They said it was the first and last lesson Horus gave to mankind. A god may cut the wind and tear the storm, but only compassion can preserve the dawn. Those words spread far beyond the borders of the desert, to distant tribes who began carving falcons upon their shields and their cave walls, praying for justice to guide them. And so, the image of Horus transcended Egypt, becoming the spirit of the entire ancient East. Though victorious, Horus sought no blind worship. He only wished humanity to understand that light is not a flame meant to burn away darkness, but a lamp to guide through the night. And so, each time the sun sank beyond the sands, when the sky turned red over the desert, people would see the shadow of a falcon soaring across the heavens, and they knew Horus was still there, watching over them, guarding Ma'at, guarding truth, guarding mankind from the chaos within their own hearts. From that time on, at every coronation, the pharaoh looked to the sky and vowed, "I am the son of Horus, and his light shall never fade." They say that among all the treasures ancient Egypt left behind, none could compare to the symbol of Horus, the eye of the god. That eye was not only the mark of power, but also a charm that protected the souls of both the living and the dead. When the pharaoh went to war, the image of that eye was always carved upon his armor, in gold and lapis lazuli, gleaming like the blue sky above the desert. The warriors believed that as long as they carried that symbol, they would never fall to darkness, for the gaze of Horus watched over them amid the sands and blood. But the eye of Horus did not belong to war alone. It was in every temple, every home, every Egyptian soul. When a person died, the priests would paint the symbol upon the coffin half light, half shadow, so that the soul of the dead would not lose its way when crossing the realm of Duat. For the eye of Horus was the gate between life and death, between mortals and the divine. It was believed that those under the eye's protection, even after thousands of years, would not fade away but would fly with the sun across the Nile of the afterlife. In ancient rituals, the eye carried a deeper meaning. It represented restoration. For Horus had once lost his eye in battle with Seth, but it was healed by his mother, the goddess Isis, through the magic of maternal love. Thus, the eye of Horus came to symbolize rebirth, the mending of a soul's wounds after great loss. When craftsmen carved that symbol onto amulets, they were not merely making an object, they were touching a prayer for the world's peace. Children wore the eye of Horus around their necks to ward off evil. Sailors carved it onto the prows of their ships, praying the waves would calm. Healers etched it upon medicine jars, believing the gaze of Horus drove away illness, preserving the balance between body and spirit. In great temples like Edfu and Dendera, the morning light shone directly upon the carved wall of the eye, its reflection spreading across the floor like the god's greeting at dawn. Pilgrims from distant lands came to kneel before it, placing their hands upon the symbol and vowing to live in order, never to betray Maat. It was no longer mere worship, but a bond that tied all Egyptian souls together, united by the faith that the justice of Horus would illuminate all. Some said that when they gazed long enough into that eye, they felt as though something gazed back a look, both stern and merciful, as if Horus himself were asking, "Do you live true to the light within your heart?" That question brought tears to many, not from fear, but from the realization that the god was not a king above, but a mirror reflecting their own souls. Every eye of Horus was drawn with perfect symmetry. The left side was the moon, the right side the sun, a symbol of the universe's wholeness. It reminded all that light could not exist without shadow, and justice could not exist without compassion. Many Egyptian philosophers called it the eyes of the world, for when Horus sees, the world is in balance. From there, the symbol spread everywhere, not only across Egypt, but throughout the Near East, carried by traders, pilgrims, and dreamers who believed that a god still watched over them from above. Through thousands of years, as the Egyptian empire fell and the sands buried the pyramids, the eye remained. It was carved upon gemstones, amulets, tombs, and even upon the walls of cities long forgotten. And strangely, though time changed and languages disappeared, the eye of Horus still carried the same message. See with truth, live with justice, and remember, light never dies. Old storytellers would end with a gentle smile. If one day you feel as though someone is watching you in the dark, don't be afraid. Perhaps it isn't your imagination, perhaps it's Horus, the god with the wings of the sky, watching to see if you still keep the light within your heart. The Egyptians believed that Horus's victory over Seth was not merely a battle between two gods, but proof of the eternal law of the world, that light and darkness, order and chaos, could never be separated. When Horus defeated Seth, he did not destroy him but forgave him, allowing Seth to live in the desert, where sandstorms and darkness reigned. For Horus understood that without darkness, light would lose its meaning. Without chaos, humankind would never cherish order. That is why Horus was not only the god of war, but also the symbol of balance, what the Egyptians called Ma'at. In every sacred ritual, there were always two candles placed opposite each other, one white, one black. When the white flame flickered, people prayed for justice and truth. When the black one burned bright, they remembered the trials, the hardships, and the shadows humanity must endure to reach the light. No one was ever allowed to extinguish either flame, for if only light remained, the world would become blind, and if only darkness, it would devour every soul. The priests in the temple of Horus at Edfu once carved into the wall the words, "One can defeat darkness, but never kill it, for within darkness lies the seed of dawn." That phrase was regarded as one of the deepest philosophies of ancient Egypt, and it was what Horus taught all mankind. Legend says that after defeating Seth, Horus did not immediately return to the throne. He walked across the lands ravaged by war. He saw rivers dried up, fields burned black, children lost without mothers, and he understood that victory was not about crushing an enemy, but about restoring life. So he commanded the Nile to flow again, breathed life into the barren soil, and there, the first lotus flowers bloomed. People called them the eyes of the god, flowers born from Seth's darkness, glowing with Horus's light. And from that day on, every dawn, as the sun rose above the desert, the lotus would open a reminder that light never dies, it only rests within the night to return stronger. In stories passed down through generations, Horus was remembered not just as a god, but as the spirit of harmony. He fought, but not from hatred. He ruled, but never through fear. When asked, "Why did you forgive the traitor?" Horus simply answered, "Because darkness needs a place to dwell, and I need a place to shine." That answer troubled many generations after, for it was not only the word of a god, but a lesson for humankind, that peace is not the absence of war, but the understanding of how to live with differences. The priests of the new kingdom taught their students, Horus did not destroy Seth, for Seth is the part of us we must control. When you conquer yourself, you are Horus. In Egypt, that philosophy became the foundation of all faiths and all dynasties. When a pharaoh issued an order, he did not do so only in the name of Horus, but also in the name of Ma'at, the sacred balance of the world, where everything must be in harmony. A king ruled by ambition would see his lands turn to dust, but one who ruled with balance, like Horus, would see the Nile overflow. Each year, during the Festival of Light, people across the land raised statues of Horus and Seth facing one another. Neither was seen as evil, both were honored as two halves of the universe. Children were taught, when you are angry, you are Seth. When you forgive, you are Horus. But when you understand both, you are a child of Egypt. Those words were carried across thousands of years, on desert winds, in carvings upon stone. And even when dynasties faded, people still remembered that Horus did not teach them to fear darkness, he taught them how to see through it. So when night fell, the priests would again light two flames, one for Horus, one for Seth. They said that when the two flames burned together, the soul of the world was reborn. And somewhere far above the Egyptian night sky, perhaps Horus still flies not to destroy the darkness, but to guard the eternal balance he created with his blood, his tears, and the compassion of a god who carried the wings of a falcon. Every sunrise in Egypt was considered a sacred moment, for people believed it was the very instant when Horus spread his falcon wings across the sky, clearing the way for the first light to touch the Nile. As the sun rose from the east, reflecting on the water's surface, they would say, "That is the gaze of Horus, shining upon the world." Fishermen, farmers, and priests all paused for a moment to bow their heads, believing the god was flying right above them, watching over every breath of the earth. Horus was seen as the keeper of life, the heartbeat between sky and river, between the sun and the land. They called him the keeper of balance, for when Horus flew past, the winds carried the warmth of life, sweeping away the night's chill and the fear in people's hearts. Children in the villages would point to the sky when they saw a falcon's shadow glide overhead and shout, "He's coming!" And the adults would simply smile, for they believed every shout was a small prayer sent to the god. Since ancient times, people had carved into temple walls the image of Horus standing on the solar bark, steering it through the river of darkness to bring light to the world. When night fell, they believed the god left the heavens to fight the spirits of shadow trying to swallow the sun, and when dawn came, he triumphed once more and opened his wings again. That cycle of light, darkness, struggle, and rebirth was the essence of Horus and the essence of life itself. Thus, every day, Egyptians lived as if flying alongside Horus through the world. They worked when the light spread, rested when the darkness returned, and always believed that no matter how long the night lasted, Horus would rise again. At Edfu Temple, the holiest sanctuary of Horus, the priests inscribed upon the stone walls, "Each dawn, the world is reborn from the wings of Horus." When sailors set out to sea, they touched the eye of Horus carved on the bow of their boats, believing the god watched over their journey. When the floods of the Nile returned, they prayed for Horus to keep the waters gentle, for he was the one who awakened the river. And when sandstorms raged, they looked up to the sky, hoping to see a dark speck glide by, a sign that Horus was still there, still keeping the world balanced between chaos and order. Beyond protecting nature, Horus was also believed to give strength to humankind. Before battle, warriors painted falcon wings on their chests and cried out, "Horus is within me." They believed that only with the courage and justice of Horus could they conquer not only their enemies but also the fear within themselves. The pharaohs believed the same. At every coronation, they stood before the statue of Horus, gazed up at the great stone wings spread wide, and swore, "I will uphold Ma'at as Horus upholds the sky." That oath was not merely a ritual, it was the promise of an entire dynasty to the gods and to the land. For centuries, kings who followed still believed Horus flew beside them, shielding their thrones from chaos and betrayal. Under Horus's reign, people not only lived in faith but learned to respect balance between strength and compassion, between battle and forgiveness. For Horus was not a god who only wielded the sword, but one who understood that true victory was keeping peace after the storm. That is why, when Egyptians saw a falcon soaring across the sky, they didn't just see a creature, they saw divinity, freedom, the union of power and wisdom. The priests called that image the path of truth. For Horus protected Egypt not only with might but with awareness. He saw even the things humans tried to hide: pride, deceit, cruelty within their hearts. And so, at every moment of the day, people lived under that gaze not out of fear, but in peace. They knew Horus never slept. Even today, thousands of years later, carvings of Horus's wings can still be found on temple walls, on amulets, on ancient ships, reminders that every morning we awaken is another victory of Horus, another return of light, another salvation of the world. So if one day you watch the sunrise, imagine those wings unfolding above, stretching over the desert, the Nile, the whole world, for that is Horus, the god of the sky, still flying, still bringing life to humankind, just as he did at the dawn of time. When Horus restored light to the world, he did not stop at being a god of protection. Horus became the symbol of an oath, the oath of justice, of courage, and of unshakable integrity. The Egyptians believed it was Horus who taught humankind how to live with an honest heart, to fight not out of hatred but for the sake of truth. On moonlit nights, when silver light touched the Nile, priests told the villagers about the oath of Horus, the night when the god stood in the desert, gazed at the star-filled sky, and said, "I swear to protect mankind from darkness not with thunder, but with the light of justice." From that day on, every Egyptian warrior going into battle repeated that vow, believing they fought in the name of Horus. In the temples, inscriptions read, "Those who fight with truth shall never fall, for Horus dwells in their hearts." The pharaohs took this as the standard for their rule. Whenever they judged a case, they placed a small statue of Horus on the table, the eyes of the god seeming to look deep into the soul of the accused. They believed no one could lie under the gaze of Horus the god who saw both deceit and repentance. Some tales say that when a corrupt official tried to conceal his crime, the statue of Horus in the temple fell and shattered as a warning. From then on, people believed even more firmly that Horus did not only live in the sky, he watched their every deed. Yet the oath of Horus was not only for war or law, but for the human soul itself. He taught that justice was not revenge, but the ability to keep balance within. One who could defeat thousands but not himself was still weak. Thus the priests often said, "If you wish for Horus to protect you, fight with light, not with darkness." In temples, images of Horus holding the sword and the scales of Ma'at were carved at the center, one hand for strength, the other for fairness. Strength without justice creates tyrants, while justice without strength is nothing but wind. Horus was the harmony of both. He defeated Seth not only with force but with wisdom and compassion. That is why the kings of Egypt, for thousands of years, called themselves the sons of Horus, for only by balancing strength and mercy could they truly be worthy to rule. From then on, the spirit of Horus became humanity's compass. When they set sail, they swore never to betray a friend. When they built temples, they swore never to lie. When they worked the fields, they swore to labor honestly, for that was how they offered themselves to Ma'at. And each time the sun set, they looked up at the sky, where a streak of crimson stretched across the clouds, and they believed it was the wing of Horus, flying to remind them of their vow. The priest said that, in the final moments of his life, Horus spoke to his children, "Justice does not dwell in heaven, but in the choices of humankind. When you choose rightly, my light will be with you." Those words were passed down through generations, carved into every Egyptian heart. When a child did wrong, the parents did not say, "You've sinned," but rather, "Horus will be sad because you forgot your oath." For to them, keeping integrity was not just a duty, it was the only way to live under the blessing of the gods. Egyptians also believed that the souls of the righteous would be carried by Horus's wings after death, across the river of spirits, to the eternal realm of light. Those who lied, betrayed, or spread hatred, however, would walk through Seth's desert where burning sands and venomous winds would wear down their souls until they learned the meaning of truth. And so, for millennia, Egyptians did not merely worship Horus. They lived with him, in their words, in their actions, in every breath between earth and sky. Horus was no longer a distant god, but a reflection of the ideal humanity aspired to. That is why, when the wind rose over the Nile, people would whisper, "He is flying above us," to see if we still remain honest. And somewhere, in the crimson glow of the sunset, the falcon shadow of Horus still soared, carrying the eternal vow that even when light is hidden, it will return. For within the human heart, Horus has never disappeared. And so, when the story of Horus came to an end, the storyteller could not turn his eyes away from the eastern sky, where the sun rose, where the first light of day shone through the golden ruins of ancient Egypt. They say that every time an eagle flies across the desert, you can hear the wind whisper like the wings of Horus, still flying through time, carrying his immortal vow. Those winds are not just the breath of the desert, but the heartbeat left behind by a civilization that once touched the divine. Some say that if you stand by the Nile at sunset and look into the crimson water reflecting the sun's glow, you will see the silhouette of great wings, not an illusion, but a reminder that Horus has never left this world. He merely flies higher, soaring above the souls, watching over them from afar. Thousands of years have passed, yet the name of Horus lives on. It is carved in stone, in prayers, in the symbol people wear over their hearts, the Eye of Horus, a mark of protection, wisdom, and faith. Though war and time may destroy all things, no one can erase what Horus planted, the yearning for justice and light within every heart. The Egyptians believed that every soul was born carrying a spark of Horus's light. When people did what was right, that light shone brighter. When they lied, it dimmed, and only honesty could make it live again. That is why Horus was not just a god above, but the symbol of all that is good in humanity, the light that overcomes darkness. Scholars of later ages still argued about Horus. Was he a real god, or a metaphor for human will? But to the Egyptians, the answer didn't matter. They understood that sometimes gods are not mighty beings standing atop Olympus, but small flames burning inside the human soul, and Horus was that flame. Every time they saw the sunrise, they remembered him. When night came, they prayed that the wings of Horus would pass once more, bringing peace to all souls sleeping beneath the sand. On the wall of the last ancient temple still standing, there is an old inscription. Horus flies forever across the sky, but his wings have become the will of mankind. The words have faded with time, but their meaning endures. Through every dynasty and every age, the story of Horus is still told by the voices of fathers, priests, and storytellers like me. They say Horus never died, for justice cannot die. As long as even one person believes in the light, his wings will keep flying through storms of sand, through the night, through the centuries of oblivion. And in that very moment, when you lift your eyes to the night sky and see the stars burning bright, you may recognize the shape of the eagle constellation spreading its wings. The Egyptians called it the flight of Horus, the path of life, of light, of souls that have overcome their trials to find their way back to dawn. For as they said in the ancient prayers, light never dies, it merely becomes a new dawn. The story of Horus is not just a legend, but a mirror reflecting humanity itself. Fragile beings who still dare to rise against darkness, who still believe in justice even when surrounded by chaos. And perhaps that is why Horus still lives not in temples, but in the hearts of those who believe that no matter how long the night lasts, the dawn will come. So if one day you stand beneath the blazing red sky of sunset, remember it is not just the sun setting. It is Horus, flying through time, watching you with the eyes of a god, and whispering through the wind. Keep the light within your heart, for only when humankind believes in the light will this world truly be saved. If you're still here, it means your heart is beating in rhythm with the stories of the night. Hit subscribe to continue this journey with me, where every shadow hides a secret waiting to be awakened. And now, turn down the lights, let your mind drift, and let sleep carry you away. Sleep well, because tonight, the world is still whispering.